Welcome, gentle traveller, to another quiet evening in the company of history. Tonight, we drift back to the cold shores of northern France, to a time when the English crown still clung to its last foothold on the continent. In the soft gloom of dawn, the port of Calais stood proud, a lonely reminder of England's former glory in France. But as the winds shifted, so too did fortune. This is the story of how Britain lost France, the fall of Calais. So settle in, let your thoughts grow quiet, and allow the distant sounds of waves and marching boots to fade into a lullaby of the past. And if these slow journeys through history bring you peace, I'd love for you to subscribe, so we can share many more restful nights together. If you close your eyes, you might almost hear it, the slow murmur of the tide along the northern coast of France, a soft rhythm brushing against walls of stone and salt. The year is somewhere around 1557. The town before you is small, sturdy, and oddly English for a place surrounded entirely by France. This is Calais, England's last window onto the continent. For more than 200 years, the Red Cross of St. George had flown over this patch of French earth. When English merchants spoke of going abroad, they did not mean to Paris or Flanders. They meant to Calais, the place that was both foreign and home. To understand what Calais meant, you must first imagine England in miniature, transplanted onto foreign soil. The cobbled lanes ran straight and narrow, flanked by houses with leaded windows and timber frames. The church bells sounded not with French peals, but with the slower English toll that marked the hours of prayer and work. Even the taverns had English names: the White Hart, the Bell, the King's Arms. Every morning, the port awoke to a familiar sequence: fishermen returning with the night's catch, soldiers rotating off guard duty, merchants checking ledgers. The narrow harbour opened into the grey waters of the Channel, a lifeline to Dover and London beyond. Ships came and went, carrying wool, tin, and sometimes whispers of unrest. The garrison of Calais was not vast, perhaps around 500 to 1,000 regular soldiers, joined by townsmen capable of bearing arms when called. Their commander, Lord Wentworth, reported directly to the English crown. Yet for all their sense of order, there was a stillness to the place, a kind of complacent calm that comes only when a danger has not yet announced itself. To the ordinary townsfolk, the war with France had long ago turned into a background hum, something written in chronicles and treaties, not something they expected to live through. Generations had been born and buried here without hearing a French command in the streets. Some of the older men, their faces worn by sea wind, could even recall tales of the great wars of Edward III or Henry V, times when England AS armies had crossed France like a storm. But by now, in the mid-16th century, that storm had long since passed. Calais had become more an outpost than a battlefield. The English crown used it as a customs gate for trade with the Low Countries. Officials collected duties on every sack of wool and every barrel of saltfish passing through its docks. The merchants grumbled about the taxes, the soldiers about their pay, and the innkeepers about both. Life went on, slowly, predictably, in the way it often does before history takes notice again. Yet, beneath this surface, there was something fragile. The walls that had once seemed unassailable were by the 1550s old and neglected. The town's defences, bastions, ditches and earthworks were relics of an earlier age. The cost of maintaining them fell to a government increasingly burdened by debt. And England herself was changing. Queen Mary, I sat upon the throne, the first queen regnant to rule England in her own right. She had married Philip of Spain, a powerful ally, but also a foreign prince whose presence stirred resentment at home. England's politics were tangled with religion and marriage alliances. Money was short, troops were scattered, and Calais, though proudly English, was far from anyone's top priority. Still, the people of Calais carried on. The market square bustled each morning. Farmers brought in turnips, onions, and eels from the surrounding marshlands. Housewives haggled over the price of bread, often baked with a mix of barley and rye. Soldiers stood watch at the gates, at Newnham Bridge, at Boulogne Gate, and at the citadel itself. where cannon lay rusting under tarps. It was a town both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, because its rhythms were those of any coastal settlement. Extraordinary, because every brick, every sound of hammer on wood, belonged to a place that had somehow survived the endless tide of continental war. And then there was the sea, always present, always grey. It was the sea that connected Calais to England. A journey of only a few hours in fair weather. The channel could be kind or cruel, and every soul in Calais knew it well. Merchants watched the horizon for sails. Soldiers watched it for relief ships. The sea was both protection and isolation, a barrier that could save or doom them, depending on which side the wind chose. At night, the town quieted. The streets emptied after curfew, and only the sound of waves against the harbour wall or a distant dog barking could be heard. The soldiers on duty sometimes spoke of home, of families in Kent or Essex, of wages not yet paid, of rumours from London about new taxes and new wars. A few would glance northward toward the French border, where the land flattened into salt marsh and reeds. There, across the ditches and dunes, lay the faint glow of French watchfires. The French frontier was closer than many in Calais liked to think. The land beyond was technically a no-man's land, patrolled by both sides. Travellers and smugglers moved quietly through it, often at night. The farmers, who worked the marshes near Guin and Hames, two small fortifications outside Calais, knew to keep their heads low when armed riders appeared. But danger, when it comes slowly, can be easy to ignore. The English administrators stationed in Calais wrote polite letters back to London, requesting funds for repairs, supplies for soldiers, and new powder for the artillery. The responses came weeks or months later, usually with promises, but little else. The Crown had debts, the treasury was thin, and England's attention was elsewhere, on its alliance with Spain, its tension with Scotland, and its uneasy peace at home. Meanwhile, in France, a different sort of quiet was stirring. King Henry II had been rebuilding his armies, reforming his fortifications, and studying the map of northern France with renewed interest. To him, Calais was not a forgotten town. It was a wound left open from the 100 Years' War, a reminder that part of France still bore another king's flag. But in Calais, the sense of safety held. The town's English families, some descended from the original conquerors, still sent their sons to serve in the garrison or the customs office. The local guilds managed trade, regulating everything from wool exports to wine imports. Priests held mass in both Latin and English, depending on the day. And the ships, slow, wide-bellied merchant vessels, still sailed between Dover and Calais, carrying goods and gossip in equal measure. There was a kind of quiet pride among the people. They believed Calais to be impregnable, not because of its strength, but because of its history. For 200 years it had withstood sieges, treaties, and neglect alike. To lose Calais was unthinkable, something that happened only in rumours or nightmares. And yet, if one had listened closely, there were hints of unease. The outer forts, those at Gans and Hames, were undermanned and undersupplied. The watchtowers needed repair. Powder stores were low. A few officers muttered about the French drills they'd seen across the marsh. But such talk was brushed aside. There was comfort in believing the danger was far away. Winter was setting in. December 1557 came cold and wet, the kind of season when armies did not usually move. The sea winds cut through wool cloaks and rattled the shutters of the houses. Fishermen cursed the weather, and even the gulls seemed to vanish inland. It was the sort of winter that encouraged staying indoors, mending nets, and waiting for spring. On some nights, the fog would roll in thick from the channel, so dense it swallowed the lamps along the walls. Guards could barely see a few feet ahead. The silence was so heavy that even the clink of a musket butt against stone seemed loud. From across the marshes now and then came the faint echo of horns, French patrols signalling in the dark. But the English garrison grew used to such sounds. They believed Calais had seen it all before, the sieges of the past, the storms, the changes of kings and queens. Surely this winter would pass like all the others, and so the town slept on. Behind its aging walls, under the watch of men whose pay was months overdue, Calais rested in the illusion of security. The markets would open again in the morning, the bells would ring, and the soldiers would patrol the same frozen streets. But across the fields, in the frost-bitten distance, another sound was beginning. The creak of wooden wheels, the muffled steps of men marching through snow, and the low rumble of cannon being drawn forward. The French were moving, and Calais, England's last stronghold in France, had no idea what was coming. To understand why Calais stood where it did, and why its loss would one day wound England so deeply, you must step backward in time, not a few years, but centuries. For Calais was not merely a town of trade and walls. It was a monument to an old idea, that the kings of England were also kings of France. That belief began long before Queen Mary, before even Henry VIII. It began in the early 1300s, when dynasties crossed and tangled like ivy across the walls of Europe. The English King Edward III claimed the French crown through his mother, Isabella of France, a claim that set fire to two nations for over 100 years. The 100 Years' War, as it would later be called, was not one war but many, a series of campaigns, truces, and uneasy peace treaties that stretched across generations. Knights grew old fighting it, and their sons took up the same quarrels. It was during that long struggle, in 1347, that Calais first came into English hands. Edward III, having won a great victory at Crecy, turned his attention to this small but strategic port on the Channel. Calais was well fortified, but after an 11-month siege, hunger and exhaustion forced its surrender. Chroniclers of the time tell of the 6 burghers of Calais, prominent townsmen who offered themselves as hostages to spare the rest of the population. They walked barefoot, with ropes around their necks, carrying the keys of the city. The story goes that Edward ordered their execution, but his queen, Philippa of Hainault, pleaded for mercy. The king relented, and Calais was spared. From that day onward, Calais became England's doorway to the continent. It was fortified, garrisoned, and populated by English settlers. The French inhabitants were expelled or absorbed, and the town took on an unmistakably English character. For 2 centuries, Calais was both a symbol and a tool. Its docks shipped English wool, the foundation of the medieval economy, to markets in Flanders and beyond. In return, fine cloth, wine, and spices flowed back toward London. It was said that whoever held Calais controlled the narrow sea. Through the reigns of Edward, Richard, Henry, and beyond, Calais endured. The 100 Years' War came and went like a long storm. There were triumphs. Agincourt, for instance, where Henry V's outnumbered archers broke the flower of French chivalry. But there were also reverses. Long sieges lost, alliances broken, treasuries emptied. By the late 1400s, the English presence in France had shrunk to almost nothing. One by one, the great cities of Normandy and Aquitaine were retaken by the French crown. Rouen, Bordeaux, Bayonne, all gone. When the dust settled, only Calais remained English. It was a strange inheritance, a relic of a bygone war, clinging to the edge of a continent that no longer wanted it. And yet, Calais held on. English kings came and went. Henry VI lost his throne to Edward IV, who lost it again. Henry VII rose from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. But through it all, the Red Cross still flew above Calais. To the merchants of London, this was a comfort. It meant trade with Europe remained open. To the soldiers, it meant honour and service abroad. To the monarchs, it was a matter of pride, proof that England still held a piece of France. But to the French, Calais was a reminder of humiliation, a city lost to foreign rule for centuries. Every French monarch, from Charles VII onward, dreamed of its return. In quieter moments, the town itself began to feel like a museum of older days. The walls were built for archers, not cannons. The narrow gates were suited for horsemen, not artillery trains. The English garrison still drilled with longbows, though firearms had long since changed the nature of war. The surrounding countryside had its own story. Villages like Gane and Hames were technically part of the Pale of Calais, the thin strip of English territory stretching inland for a few miles. Farmers tilled the heavy clay soil and paid taxes to English officials, but their lives were neither rich nor easy. The marshes bred disease in summer, and the winters were cruel. Somewhere between Dover and Calais, the idea of England blurred. Not fully one country, not fully the other. To live in Calais was to live in a borderland. Soldiers came and went, officials changed with each reign, and the townsfolk learned to speak both languages just enough to survive. But the English stamp remained, in the church services, in the marketplace law, even in the manner of dress. It is easy, from a distance, to think of Calais as a fortress, all walls and cannon. But the truth was quieter. It was a community, small, worn, but persistent. Children grew up chasing each other through the same cobbled alleys their grandparents had known. Bakers opened their shutters before dawn, spreading the smell of coarse bread through the streets. Fishermen tied up their boats, their hands raw from salt and rope. The wars of the past lingered mostly in memory, passed down in stories told by the old. Some still spoke of the siege of 1347, though none living had seen it. Others recalled the time when English kings still claimed to be kings of France, their coats of arms quartered with the fleur-de-lis. By the mid-1500s, that claim was little more than a formality. Henry VIII, in his pride, had revived it briefly, but his wars in France achieved little. He spent vast sums, captured a few towns, and lost them again. When he died in 1547, England was no stronger abroad than when he began. His daughter, Mary I, inherited his burdens. She sought stability through marriage, a union with Philip II of Spain, the mightiest Catholic ruler in Europe. It was a political match, meant to strengthen England's place among Catholic powers and to counter France's growing might. But the alliance came with complications. England found itself drawn into Spain's wars. When Philip and Henry II of France clashed in 1557, Mary's government was obliged to send troops to aid her husband's cause. For France, this was opportunity. Henry II saw that England's attention was divided and its resources stretched thin. Calais, he knew, was under-defended. Its garrison was small, its walls neglected, and it stood alone, separated from England by a narrow but often stormy sea. Still, there were many in England who believed Calais untouchable. They remembered how it had withstood French sieges before. They told themselves that history had proven English strength, that 200 years of possession meant permanence. But history has a way of returning to its unfinished business. The same marshes that had once seen Edward III's tents now lay silent beneath winter frost. The same winds that had filled English sails now carried whispers of a coming storm. The war that had begun in the 14th century, with claims of kingship and long sieges, would find its final echo here, in this quiet, aging town. The echo of the 100 Years' War still haunted Calais. Its towers and walls were built by men who believed England and France would forever struggle for supremacy. They could not have known that in less than a century, that long rivalry would end, not with a triumph, but with a quiet, devastating loss. And so, as 1557 turned into 1558, the ghosts of old wars lingered in the cold air. The men guarding the ramparts of Calais stood on stones laid by their ancestors, never realizing they were about to become the last generation to do so. History was circling back, and the sound of its approach was muffled only by the winter wind. If you were standing there, looking out across the frozen marshes, hearing only the faint creak of wooden gates, you might have thought the world was sleeping. But in the distance, beyond the fog, the next act of an ancient war was already beginning to stir. What did it mean, after all these centuries, for a war's echo to return to the very place it began? When you open your eyes again, the world of 1557 feels oddly familiar, both ancient and recognizable, as though time itself has changed its clothing but not its posture. Europe, at that moment, was a continent of uneasy alliances, of kingdoms tied together by blood, religion, and mistrust. It was a place where the echo of one ruler's ambition could travel across borders like the sound of distant thunder. England, small in land but vast in pride, sat balanced precariously between old memories and new fears. At its helm was Queen Mary Tudor, Mary the France, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Her reign had begun only a few years earlier, but already it carried the heavy weight of restoration and unrest. Mary's world was not the confident, exploratory England of Elizabeth's later years. It was a weary realm, economically strained, religiously divided, and politically cautious. The golden age that historians would later celebrate had not yet dawned. The country was still recovering from years of turbulence, the break with Rome, the dissolution of monasteries, and the political executions that had followed her father's temper. Mary had come to power promising stability and faith, a return to the old Catholic order that her father had torn down. To her, religion was not merely doctrine, but duty. It was the thread that, if restored, might mend England's spiritual and political fractures. But to many of her subjects, it was a return to fear, to heresy trials, public burnings, and whispers of foreign influence. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, son of the mighty Emperor Charles V, was meant to secure England's position in Europe. Spain was powerful, rich from its colonies, and devoutly Catholic. On paper, the union made sense. Yet to ordinary Englishmen, Philip was a foreign prince, Spanish, aloof, and ambitious. His presence in England, even as Mary's husband, stirred unease. When Philip visited London, the crowds were polite but distant. He spoke little English, preferred his Spanish advisors, and soon left for the continent to manage his empire. Mary adored him, but England merely tolerated him. Their marriage, though intended to unite nations, instead deepened the sense of England's isolation. It was within this web of alliances that the fate of Calais was quietly decided. France, under King Henry II, watched from across the Channel with interest. Henry was no stranger to war. He had inherited his father's ambition and his grandfather's caution. France was powerful again, its borders secure, and its armies well-trained. Henry's eyes turned toward the north, to Flanders, where Spanish and French interests clashed, and to Calais, where England still held its fading claim. In the summer of 1557, war flared once more between France and Spain. England, bound to Spain through Mary's marriage, found itself drawn into the conflict almost by obligation. Philip urged his wife's council to send troops in support of his campaigns. Though cautious, the English government agreed, dispatching soldiers to fight on the continent under Spanish command. This decision, made in the interest of diplomacy, left England vulnerable and Calais dangerously exposed. While the armies marched toward Flanders, the small garrison in Calais remained unchanged. Its commander, Lord Thomas Wentworth, was a man of cautious temperament, dutiful but not daring. He had written repeatedly to the Privy Council in London, requesting more funds and men to repair the town's aging defences. The responses, when they came, were sympathetic but slow. The treasury was thin, the Queen had debts to pay, the weather was bad. The letters grew polite, then perfunctory, then silent. Across the narrow sea, the French gathered their strength. Henry II placed his trust in François, Duke of Guise, a soldier of immense skill and quiet confidence. The Duke had distinguished himself in Italy, capturing cities with swiftness and precision. To him, Calais was not merely a target of opportunity, but a wound to be healed. France could not be whole, he believed, while an English flag still flew upon her soil. It was a cold winter that year, bitter even by northern standards. The marshes around Calais froze, and the wind came sharp off the sea. Roads hardened into stone, and the rivers turned sluggish with ice. To most commanders, such weather was a signal to rest their troops until spring. But to Guise, it was an opening. The frozen ground would make it easier to move artillery across the otherwise impassable terrain. By December, French scouts had begun their quiet work, measuring distances, counting towers, and marking the weaknesses of the outer forts. The English, distracted and undermanned, noticed little. Meanwhile, life in Calais continued with its usual rhythm. Merchants grumbled about taxes. Taverns stayed warm with gossip and ale. The soldiers of the garrison passed their days in routine drills and long watches. The only hint of unease came from the occasional rumour of French camps near Boulogne, of new roads being built through the dunes. But such talk, like the winter fog, tended to drift away. In London, the court of Mary Tudor was consumed by other matters. The Queen's health was failing. She suffered from recurring fevers and, by many accounts, melancholy. Her hopes of an heir, once bright, had faded with 2 false pregnancies. The marriage that was meant to secure her dynasty had left her lonely, her husband often abroad. In her absence, the machinery of government creaked along as best it could. The Privy Council debated expenses, the Treasury rationed coin, and letters from Calais continued to arrive, warning of disrepair. Few in England realised how fragile their position in France had become. The Channel, narrow as it was, might as well have been a gulf of time and attention. Winter storms made communication slow. Even urgent dispatches could take days to cross. When they arrived, they landed in a capital distracted by illness, debt, and politics. Yet if you could look down on Europe in that winter of 1557, not as a map, but as a living thing, you would see the pattern forming. Spain and France at war, England drawn reluctantly into the fray, Calais left as the one loose thread between them. The armies of France were modern, disciplined, armed with artillery, their logistics refined by years of continental campaigns. The English garrison, in contrast, seemed like a holdover from another century. Their uniforms were faded, their pay irregular, their confidence rooted more in tradition than readiness. Still, they believed themselves secure. Calais had been English since before any of them were born. Its capture in 1347 was part of every schoolboy's lesson, its endurance a point of pride. To lose Calais was unthinkable, like losing Dover itself. But the world had changed around them. The England of Edward III, who first took Calais, was gone. The England of Mary, I was poorer, smaller, and more uncertain. The country had lost much of its influence on the continent. Its ships were not yet the masters of the sea they would later become. It was, in every sense, between worlds, still half medieval, half modern. The French knew it. So did the Spanish. Perhaps even Mary knew it, though she could never admit it aloud. As December deepened, the signs became harder to ignore. French movements near Boulogne increased. Small skirmishes were reported by scouts near the outer forts. Wentworth sent yet another letter to London, pleading for reinforcements. The sea was rough, he explained. Supplies were low. If the enemy moved, he would be hard-pressed to hold them off. The answer, when it came weeks later, was polite. And too late. Still, in those first cold weeks, Calais remained deceptively peaceful. The wind howled through the chimneys, waves lashed the harbour, and inside the walls, the people went on with their lives. Bakers, soldiers, priests, fishermen, all moving through their routines as though repetition itself could ward off change. And perhaps that is what made the coming disaster so cruel. Calais did not fall because its people were cowardly or weak. It fell because time had passed it by. The fortress that had once symbolized England's power was now little more than a shadow of its former self, kept alive by memory and habit. Across the frozen marshes, the French army gathered like a silent tide. Guise's men waited for the order to move. The night air was still, the stars dim behind thin clouds, and in Calais, as church bells marked the last nights of the year, no one knew they were living the final days of English France. What happens to a nation when its past grows heavier than its present? When the pride of history blinds it to the quiet movements of the world around it? If you could step quietly into Calais in the year 1557, you might not at first realize you were standing on a piece of England. The air would taste of salt and cold wind from the channel, the cobbled streets lined with whitewashed houses, narrow and sharp-roofed against the sea storms. There would be fishmongers calling in the market square, the smell of eels, smoked herring, and tar from the ships. But listen a little closer, and the accents are different. English voices, shaped by Kent and Essex, mingling with the softer tones of the Picard merchants who lived just beyond the walls. This was England's last outpost on the continent, a small town perched between two worlds. For more than 200 years, Calais had been an English possession. It was not quite a colony, not quite a foreign conquest, more like a stubborn remnant of a dream that had long since faded. When Edward III captured it in 1347, after nearly a year of siege, it became a symbol of English victory during the 100 Years' War. The town was emptied of its French inhabitants and resettled by English families, tradesmen, and soldiers. Every generation since had known Calais, not as a battlefield, but as home. By the mid-16th century, that home had settled into a rhythm of quiet endurance. The people of Calais lived their lives by the tides and the calendar of royal orders. Ships came from Dover and Sandwich, bringing wool, salted meat, and letters from the crown. Garrison life was constant but dull. Drills, watch duty, endless maintenance of the walls, the moats, and the guns. The harbour had silted, forcing larger vessels to anchor farther out. But still, it was England's gateway to Europe. From here, armies had once marched to France and Flanders. Ambassadors had come and gone. Kings had visited. Even Henry VIII had stood on these same ramparts once, his bright armour catching the sea light. Yet the town was small, barely 3,000 souls counting soldiers and families. Its fortifications were old-fashioned by the new standards of warfare. Cannon had changed everything. The medieval towers of Calais, once mighty, were now thick with repairs, masonry patched with timber. Older gunports widened clumsily to hold heavier ordnance. Along the ramparts, guards paced slowly, their breath misting in the cold air. Beyond the walls stretched the flatlands, the Pale of Calais, about 6 miles of farmland and villages that were also English soil. Those villages, though, told a quieter story. Hames, Gans, and Sangata, small places of thatched roofs, peat fires, and tired faces. The people here had known little change for decades. They were farmers who paid their taxes to English officers, but traded daily with the French across the border. Their children learned both languages. Their loyalties were mostly to the land and to survival. Borders meant little to a man who spent his life tending sheep in the marsh or dredging oysters along the coast. In Calais itself, daily life was tightly bound to military presence. The town governor, Lord Wentworth, was the king's man, answerable directly to London. The garrison numbered around 500, though the rolls claimed more. Many were veterans of the wars in Scotland or campaigns in Boulogne. Their pay was often late. Their families lived in narrow quarters, sharing food and rumour. In the taverns by the docks, sailors spoke of renewed conflict between Spain and France, of uneasy peace between Mary of England and her Spanish husband, Philip II. Some feared that England might soon be drawn into another continental war, though few imagined the danger would come to Calais itself. The English townsfolk were proud of their heritage. They kept their customs, celebrating St. George's Day, holding markets under the royal arms, maintaining parish registers in English script. But slowly, quietly, a sense of distance had crept in. They were governed by England, but surrounded by France. The local trade, the food, even the servants often came from the French countryside. English coins circulated alongside French ones. The men of Calais spoke English, but their children, playing in the streets, might slip into French when they didn't think about it. There was also religion, a tension less visible, but more deeply felt. Mary the Fire, now Queen of England, had restored the old faith after years of Protestant reform. In Calais, as in London, the Mass had returned. Priests wore vestments again. Latin chants filled the chapels. Some rejoiced, Others muttered in secret. There had been burnings in England, heretics condemned for denying the Mass. Even here, in this far corner of English territory, the smoke of those fires seemed to drift across the sea. The people of Calais had no appetite for martyrdom. They wanted peace, food, wages, and to be left alone. And yet, beyond the safety of the town walls, the world was restless. French armies were gathering strength again. Henry II of France had not forgotten the humiliation of losing Calais more than 2 centuries earlier. He saw it as a wound that must be healed, a debt that must be repaid. To the French court, Calais was a constant reminder that English kings had once claimed the crown of France. It was, in their eyes, a thorn that had festered too long. Meanwhile, the English crown seemed distracted. Mary was deeply tied to her Spanish husband's wars. She had pledged soldiers and ships to aid Spain against France. But her resources were strained, her treasury thin. To many in England, Calais was a costly relic, expensive to defend, yet too symbolic to abandon. It was said in council meetings that Calais is the brightest jewel in the English crown. Few realized how dim that jewel had become. The garrison kept its routine. Every evening, the watch bell sounded at the gatehouse. The drawbridges were raised and lanterns lit along the parapets. From the sea tower, one could see the faint lights of the French coast across the dark water. They looked close enough to touch. Inside the walls, the streets grew quiet, save for the clatter of a cartwheel or the bark of a stray dog. The soldiers took turns on night duty, their halberds resting against the walls. It was a life of waiting, for orders, for ships, for news. There were small moments of comfort too. Fishermen mending nets by the harbour, women gathering driftwood on the shore, the smell of bread from the bakeries, where grain from Flanders was milled into coarse loaves. On Sundays, families walked to church, cloaked against the wind, the bells echoing faintly over the marsh. It was a small, proud community, not glamorous, not powerful, but enduring. Yet beneath that calm surface, small cracks were forming. Supplies were low. The outer fort of Newnham Bridge had fallen into disrepair. The nearby outpost at Ghan needed more men. The governor's letters to London went unanswered for weeks. Winter was approaching, and the sea crossings were dangerous. Some of the soldiers murmured that they hadn't been paid in months. Others whispered about French scouts seen beyond the river, the kind of whispers that never quite make it to official reports. Still, life went on. The townspeople trusted their walls, their cannons, and their history. Calais had survived worse before: the great sieges, the wars of the roses, the shifting tides of kings and faiths. To them, danger was something that always loomed far away, and yet, if one stood on the ramparts on a cold evening in late 1557, looking south toward the French border, the landscape would seem too still. The fields lay frozen under thin mist. The wind carried faint sounds, not of the sea, but of distant movement. Perhaps wagons, perhaps something else. No one could yet see the shape of the storm that was gathering, but the silence had changed. It is often like this in history. Peace resting gently on the edge of collapse, people unaware that their ordinary day will soon be remembered as the last of its kind. And so, as the winter deepened and the garrison prepared for another quiet month of routine patrols, few could imagine that within a year, Calais, this last piece of England in France, would fall. But what, you might wonder, does it truly mean for a city to fall? Is it the loss of its walls, its people, or something more? The slow surrender of belief that it could ever be held again. Winter came early in 1557. The winds across the Channel turned sharp, and the harbour at Calais froze at its edges. Frost gathered on the ramparts, and the soldiers stamped their boots against the stone to keep warm. The air smelled of salt and iron, the scent of a garrison living by the sea and waiting for news that rarely came. Inside the walls, life slowed to its winter rhythm. Fires were rationed carefully. Food stores were measured by the week. The governor, Lord Thomas Wentworth, worried constantly over supplies. His letters to the Privy Council in London spoke of shortages, of powder, of pay, of men, and always the same polite promises that relief would come soon. But the ships from Dover grew fewer. The Channel was rough, and England's attention was fixed elsewhere. Spain's war with France was draining resources faster than Mary's treasury could replace them. Calais, meanwhile, remained what it had been for 2 centuries. A lonely corner of England on the edge of another land. It was a symbol, yes, but a neglected one. Even the soldiers had begun to feel that neglect. Some were veterans, their faces weathered from long campaigns in Scotland or Flanders. Others were young, restless, and poorly trained. They served because there were few other options. Their pay came late, sometimes not at all. They sold their rations to local traders, took odd jobs when they could, or slipped away to visit taverns across the Pale, where the beer was stronger and the French girls kinder. There was a strange quiet that winter, a lull that seemed to stretch too long. The older officers noticed it. Patrols beyond the walls reported fewer travellers. The roads that led south toward Boulogne were empty. No merchants, no wagons, not even shepherds in the fields. It was as if the land itself had emptied of life. Lord Wentworth did what men in his position always do. He wrote reports. He requested reinforcements from England, urged for the forts at Guan and Hamas to be supplied, and warned that the French seemed unusually still. In London, those letters were read, noted, and filed away among 100 other worries. England had committed its strength to support Spain's King Philip in his war against France. Calais was not forgotten, but it was far from the Queen's priority. On the French side, though, movement had begun. King Henry II of France had long dreamed of reclaiming Calais. He saw it not merely as a strategic port, but as a national wound that had never healed since Edward III's siege more than 200 years before. His counsellors warned him it would be difficult. The English garrison, the fortified harbour, the marshes that made attack nearly impossible in summer. But now it was winter. The marshes were frozen, the rivers hard. For the first time in generations, an army could move swiftly across the plain. In late December 1557, French scouts began to appear near the border. Peasants reported soldiers on the move, cavalry in small bands, engineers measuring ground, the distant rumble of wagons. At first, the garrison at Calais dismissed it as rumour, but in the villages of the Pale, Gand, Neuilly, Sangatte, farmers saw campfires on the horizon and heard horns echoing faintly in the night. It was the Duke of Guise, François, one of France's most ambitious commanders, who led the operation. He was young, brilliant, and deeply loyal to King Henry. After his triumph at Metz, he had become France's favoured general. Now he sought to do what no Frenchman had done since 1347, take back Calais. He planned quickly and quietly. His army, numbering perhaps 30,000 men, gathered under cover of winter fog. They marched not directly from Paris or Boulogne, but through Flanders, avoiding the usual routes to conceal their numbers. The advance was carefully timed, so sudden that the English would have little warning. By early January 1558, the French forces had crossed the frontier. They moved with startling speed, seizing the outlying forts before Calais could react. Gien was surrounded first. Its garrison of only 200 men fought bravely, but could not hold. The French guns shattered its walls within days. The commander, Sir Henry Palmer, was wounded and captured. Hamas fell soon after. In Calais, word came late, too late. A messenger rode hard from Gand, arriving at dawn, his horse lathered and eyes wide with terror. He brought news that the French were advancing in force, thousands of them, with artillery and cavalry. Wentworth read the report and went pale. The alarm bells rang through the town, the gates were barred, the bridges drawn up. Men rushed to the walls. From the ramparts, they could see smoke rising to the south, the villages burning, the French banners approaching. The Duke of Guise's army was moving fast, fanning out across the Pale, cutting off every road to the sea. Inside Calais, confusion reigned. The garrison numbered fewer than 500 men. The walls, old and thin, had not been repaired properly in years. There were only a handful of cannon fit for service. The powder stores were damp from salt air. Wentworth sent desperate messages to England. "The enemy is upon us. Send aid immediately." But the sea was too rough for ships to cross, and London did not believe the situation was as dire as he claimed. Many thought the French could never capture Calais in winter. It was impossible, they said. The marshes would hold them back, the walls would stand, as they always had. But this was no ordinary attack. The French moved with precision. Their artillery was advanced, heavy culverins and cannon that could smash old medieval walls within hours. The Duke of Guise established his main camp near Sangatte, within striking distance of the town. His engineers began digging trenches toward the walls, working day and night under the frozen sky. In Calais, the townsfolk huddled in their houses, listening to the dull boom of distant guns. The soldiers worked feverishly to strengthen the defences, dragging carts of earth, patching cracks in the ramparts with timber. The governor rode from bastion to bastion, shouting orders, his cloak whipping in the wind. The first cannonballs struck the walls of Calais on January 3rd, 1558. The ground shook with each impact. Dust fell from the rafters of houses near the harbour. By nightfall, the horizon was a glow of fire, the French siege lines burning with torches and furnaces for their shot. Still, Wentworth hoped for relief. He believed the Queen would send ships and men from Dover as soon as the weather cleared. But the Channel remained stormy, and London's council hesitated. The reports they received were confused. Some said Calais was merely threatened, others that it was already besieged. Days passed. No aid came. Meanwhile, the French pressed closer. They had taken the outer fort at Risbank, cutting off the harbour. Then came the assault on Newnham Bridge, the last line before the town's main walls. The English defenders fought desperately, firing until their powder was gone, then retreating under the cover of smoke. By the evening of January 6th, the French controlled nearly all approaches to Calais. Inside the walls, despair began to take root. Supplies were nearly exhausted. The wounded filled the churches. Civilians packed their few belongings, ready to flee if the gates fell. Some soldiers spoke quietly of surrender. Others swore they would fight to the last man. And still the cold deepened. Ice formed on the moats. The town slept in brief, frightened intervals, waking at each cannon's roar. Wentworth, sleepless and pale, wrote another letter to the Queen, begging for aid. It was never answered. In the French camp, the Duke of Guise prepared for the final assault. He rode along the lines at dawn, his armour shining faintly in the weak light, his men cheering as he passed. He promised them that within a day, the English flag would no longer fly over Calais. At sunrise on January 7th, the guns opened fire again, hundreds of them, pounding the same stretch of wall until it collapsed in thunder and smoke. The French infantry surged forward, crossing the broken moat, climbing the rubble under musket fire. The defenders fought bravely, but they were too few. By noon, the French were inside the town. Calais, the last English stronghold in France, was falling. But before the final surrender, something lingered in the air, a disbelief, almost a silence, as if the people could not yet understand what was happening. For over 2 centuries, they had believed these walls were England itself. Now they crumbled beneath their feet. And somewhere, across the frozen channel, the winds carried the faint echo of the cannon. Unnoticed by most, a sound that marked the end of an age. When a kingdom loses its last foothold on foreign soil, what truly ends? The empire, the pride, or simply the illusion that such things can last forever? If you had walked the walls of Calais on the morning of January 2nd, 1558, you would have seen nothing remarkable, at least not at first glance. The sea was rough, the tide low, the wind cutting and grey. The streets below were quiet, shutters drawn tight against the cold. But if you listened closely, beyond the whine of the wind, you might have caught something unusual. The faint, rhythmic thunder of distant guns. Not close enough to threaten, but near enough to unsettle. By midday, there was no mistaking it. Smoke was rising in the distance. The soldiers on watch reported enemy movement near the village of Freton, just beyond the marsh. At first, the officers dismissed it as French raiders. nothing the garrison hadn't handled before. But when the first shells landed near the outer wall of the fort at Calais, even the most skeptical among them began to understand. The French were not probing, they were advancing. Lord Thomas Wentworth, the governor of Calais, received the reports with grim calm. He was a man accustomed to slow-burning crises, late pay, poor supplies, letters unanswered by London. But this was different. These were no scattered troops. These were the banners of France, the fleur-de-lis carried by thousands, advancing in silence through the winter fog. Wentworth gathered his council in the Governor S. Hall, the stone chamber lined with tapestries faded by sea air. His captains stood before him, faces pale and tired from years of underfunding and neglect. They had fewer than 500 effective soldiers in the town, and perhaps another 100 in the nearby forts. The walls, though stout, were built in another age, strong against catapults and scaling ladders, but not against cannon. The council argued late into the night. Some urged immediate retreat to England, while the harbour was still open. Others insisted they could hold until reinforcements came. But Wentworth refused to abandon the town. To leave Calais without a fight would be unthinkable, an insult to every English king since Edward III. So they prepared, as best they could. The town's bells were rung to summon every able-bodied man. The drawbridges were lifted, and the outer gates reinforced with barrels of sand and timber. The old culverins, rusted, creaking things, were hauled into position along the ramparts. Powder barrels were opened, muskets distributed. The harbour was closed to all traffic. Civilians were ordered to stay indoors or report to designated shelters in the churches. As night fell, the first snow began to fall, light at first, then heavy, covering the marshes in a white stillness that swallowed sound. Out beyond the walls, unseen in the darkness, the French were building their siege lines. The Duke of Guise had chosen his position carefully. His army, numbering between 25,000 and 30,000 men, encircled the town in a great crescent. Engineers dug trenches and gun platforms, while cavalry patrolled the flanks. His artillery, drawn by teams of horses across the frozen ground, was placed with precision. Each cannon was aligned to strike a different section of the wall, their angles calculated to break the defences as quickly as possible. Inside Calais, there was a growing sense of unease. The soldiers were brave, but they were not fools. They knew how hopeless it looked. Their powder was damp, their supplies low, and their communication with England uncertain. Still, they took their posts on the walls, lighting torches against the cold, peering into the white void where the French lines lay hidden. Then came the first bombardment. It began before dawn on January 3rd, a low, steady rumble that shook the earth. The French guns opened fire in coordinated bursts, their iron shots slamming into the walls with terrifying force. Each impact sent fragments of stone flying. Windows shattered, roof tiles cracked. The air filled with dust and smoke. The garrison fired back where it could, but their smaller guns were no match for the French artillery. Most of the English shot fell short or vanished into the fog. Still, they kept at it, the rhythm of firing and reloading a small defiance against the overwhelming noise. By midday, the bombardment intensified. The French had found their range. The curtain wall near the Boulogne gate began to crumble. Whole sections sagged inward, revealing the earthen core beneath. The defenders rushed to reinforce it with timber and barrels filled with earth, but each new volley undid their work. Meanwhile, in the streets below, civilians huddled in cellars and churches. Mothers hushed their children as the walls shook. In St. Mary's Church, a group of townsfolk knelt before the altar, praying quietly as dust fell from the ceiling with each explosion. A few elderly men remembered the stories of Edward III's siege 2 centuries before, how the French had starved rather than surrender. But this time, there would be no long starvation, no negotiation. This would be swift. Lord Wentworth refused to yield. He moved constantly between the bastions, his cloak stiff with frost, encouraging the men, promising that help would come from England. He ordered the remaining powder to be divided carefully between the key defences: the Watergate, the Market Bastion, and the Lantern Tower. That night, the wind shifted. It carried with it the sound of horns and shouted orders. The French were moving closer. Their sappers had advanced their trenches almost to the moat. In the flickering torchlight, English sentries could see them. Dark shapes crawling through the mist, shoveling earth, dragging ladders, assembling platforms for the next day's assault. Muskets cracked from the walls, and cries echoed in the darkness. But the French kept working. On the morning of January 4th, the bombardment resumed, heavier than before. Now the French guns were closer, their fire more accurate. The bastion of Newnham Bridge, one of the outer defences, took the brunt of the assault. Its commander, Captain Nicholas Alexander, held out until the walls began to split beneath him. When the breach widened, he ordered his men to retreat to the inner gate, covering the withdrawal with muskets until the last moment. By afternoon, the French had taken Newnham Bridge. The English counterattacked briefly, but were driven back. The French flag was raised over the ruined fort, visible from the town walls. The sight sent a chill through the defenders. Calais was now directly exposed. That night, a freezing fog settled over the town. The wind off the sea howled through the gaps in the walls. The defenders shivered at their posts, their breath visible in the torchlight. Some prayed quietly, others stared into the dark, listening for the next sound of cannon. Inside the governor's hall, Wentworth wrote another desperate dispatch to London. "The enemy is within half a mile of the town. Their artillery doth batter without ceasing. We are sorely distressed. If succour come not soon, I fear we cannot hold." But no succour came. The channel was impassable, and the English council, still sceptical of how dire the situation truly was, delayed their response. By January 5th, the French had completed their siege lines. They encircled Calais entirely. The bombardment never stopped. Every few minutes, another cannonball slammed into the walls, sending clouds of stone dust into the air. The defenders were exhausted. Sleep came only in snatches, stolen between alarms. The people of Calais endured it with a kind of grim resignation. The bakers still lit their ovens each morning. The fishmongers salted what little they had left. Children, too young to understand, played with bits of broken cannon shot in the streets. Life went on, even as the world around them collapsed. By now, the French guns had opened a wide breach in the main wall. The moat was frozen solid, making it easy for the attackers to cross. Wentworth ordered every available man to that sector. They dragged carts, barrels, even furniture to build a makeshift barricade behind the gap. As dawn broke on January 6th, the French made their move. Under a hail of musket fire, they advanced across the ice, shouting, drums beating. The English fired until their muskets grew too hot to hold. For a brief moment the line held, then broke. The French surged forward, climbing the rubble, forcing the defenders back step by step. By midday, the fighting had reached the inner streets. The defenders fell back to the citadel. Wentworth, realizing the hopelessness of further resistance, began negotiations. The Duke of Guise, proud but not cruel, offered honourable terms. The English soldiers could withdraw, their lives spared. On January 7th, the gates of Calais were opened. The French marched in. After 2 centuries of English rule, the town was once again French, and so ended the siege, not with heroism or glory, but with exhaustion and disbelief. The banners of England were lowered, and for the first time since Edward III, no English flag flew upon French soil. But as the soldiers laid down their arms, a question lingered in the cold air. What truly is lost when a nation surrenders a piece of its past? A fortress, a symbol, or a fragment of its identity itself? By the morning of January 7th, 1558, Calais, England's last stronghold in France, was little more than a trembling shell. The once solid ramparts were torn open in half a dozen places. The air hung heavy with gunpowder and the bitter scent of smoke. Houses along the outer walls had been reduced to piles of splintered beams and smouldering brick. The church bells, which had once called the faithful to prayer, were silent now, cracked from the concussions of French artillery. Inside the governor's hall, Lord Thomas Wentworth stood before a small, flickering fire, his armour dulled with grime, his eyes sunken from exhaustion. His officers gathered around him, a handful of weary faces, men who had fought for 3 days without rest. They all knew what was coming. The French guns had ceased their fire for the first time in hours, but it was not mercy that silenced them. It was readiness. Outside the walls, François, Duke of Guise, had ordered his men to prepare for the final assault. His artillery had done its work. The outer defences were shattered, the moat frozen solid, the English utterly isolated. There would be no more negotiations, no more waiting. France had come to reclaim her own. Wentworth looked to the east window, where faint light seeped through the smoke. He turned to his men and spoke quietly, his voice hoarse from shouting above the roar of cannon. "Gentlemen, we have done what honour could require. The Queen's cause is served as far as mortal strength may go. But I will not see good men slain for the pride of one old wall. If the Duke will give quarter, we shall yield." No one argued. There was nothing left to argue for. At dawn, a white flag was raised from the Watergate. The French horns sounded in response, a slow, solemn note that echoed across the marshes. Then came the drums, steady and deliberate. The Duke of Guise rode forward, mounted on a white horse, his armour gleaming faintly in the cold light. Behind him, banners of blue and gold fluttered in the wind, the lilies of France restored. When he reached the breach in the wall, he halted. He was a soldier of skill, but also of ceremony. He knew the symbolic weight of what he was about to take. He dismounted, removed his helmet, and bowed his head briefly before entering the town. Calais had fallen. The French troops poured in, disciplined but eager. They marched through the breach, muskets shouldered, boots crunching on frozen debris. The English defenders laid down their arms as ordered. There was little resistance. Some soldiers wept, others stood in stunned silence. Lord Wentworth met the Duke of Guise at the ruined marketplace. The two men saluted, the gesture of soldiers who understood one another, even as enemies. Guise's terms were firm but not cruel. The surviving English soldiers would be allowed to depart for England, their lives spared. The civilians would remain under French rule, but were to be treated as subjects, not prisoners. Yet even with mercy, there was grief. For the people of Calais, it was not just a change of rulers, it was the collapse of an entire identity. For over 2 centuries, they had been English. Their fathers and grandfathers had lived under the lion and the crown, their prayers said for English kings, their children baptized in English churches. Now, in a single morning, all of that was swept away. Outside, the French soldiers raised their banners above the gatehouses. The fleur-de-lis fluttered where once the cross of St. George had flown. Trumpets sounded from the ramparts. The noise echoed out across the sea, a sound that, some said, was carried by the wind all the way to Dover. It was a victory that stunned Europe. Calais had been considered impregnable. Even King Henry II of France, when he first approved the campaign, had doubted it could be taken in winter. But Guise had done the impossible, captured in 8 days what England had held for 200 years. News travelled slowly across the Channel, delayed by storms. When it reached Queen Mary I, she was reportedly struck with disbelief. Some said she fainted, others said she wept openly before her council. To her, Calais was not merely a port, it was the last visible mark of England's ancient claim to France, the last remnant of the old Plantagenet dream. In her grief, she is said to have uttered words that would echo through history. "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." Whether she truly said it or not hardly matters. The sentiment was real. Within a year, Mary would be dead, her health broken, her reign remembered as one of sorrow and loss. But back in Calais, life began again, in the slow, unremarkable way that history often forgets. The French troops restored order. The governor's banner was replaced with the royal standard of France. New officials took inventory of the town, its houses, its guns, its stores. The French engineers repaired the walls, rebuilding the very bastions that had fallen under their fire. The sound of hammers replaced the sound of cannon. Many of the English families, those who could, fled across the Channel in the weeks that followed. They arrived in Dover poor, weary, and unwanted. The government provided little aid. They were Calaisians, they said, no longer belonging to any place. A few were resettled in Kent and Essex, where they lived out their days, still speaking of the pale marshes and the harbour they had lost. Those who remained in Calais were gradually absorbed into France again. The town was repopulated with French merchants and soldiers' families. The churches once again held Mass in French. The old English tombs were left to crumble, their inscriptions fading under the salt air. In England, the loss of Calais was more than a strategic failure. It was a psychological blow. For centuries, English kings had dreamed of ruling France. Now even the smallest remnant of that dream was gone. The chroniclers wrote of it with bitterness. Some blamed Queen Mary's marriage to Spain, saying England had sacrificed its own defence for Philip's wars. Others blamed neglect, the slow decay of a garrison that had been starved of men and money. But history is rarely the story of one cause. Calais had fallen because time itself had moved on. The world of medieval castles and endless sieges was gone, replaced by new powers, new weapons, and new ideas. The town that Edward III had taken with bowmen and ladders could not survive the age of gunpowder. The Duke of Guy's victory marked more than a change of borders. It marked the end of England, its medieval claim to continental empire. From that point onward, England would turn its gaze elsewhere, to the seas, to trade, and eventually to new worlds far beyond Europe. The loss of Calais was the closing of one chapter, painful, humiliating, but necessary, before the opening of another. And yet, for those who lived through it, it was not a story of destiny. It was a story of broken walls, of hunger and cold, of letters unanswered and courage met with silence. The soldiers who stood on the walls of Calais in that final week did not think of empire or legacy. They thought only of surviving another dawn. In the end, all empires fade, not with a single blow, but with a long sigh, a slow crumbling of neglect, of distance, of time. Calais was not stolen from England. It slipped away, piece by piece, until only the name remained. And so, on that grey morning of January 8th, as the French trumpets sounded and the white frost melted beneath the boots of marching men, England's age in France came to its quiet close. The sea would wash the harbour walls, the gulls would cry above the ruins, and the people, as people always do, would learn to live under new flags. Still, one question lingered in the hearts of those who remembered. When a nation loses its last place abroad, does it lose part of its soul, or does it finally come home? The winter of 1558 settled heavily over England, grey, wet, and full of uneasy silences. The loss of Calais had not yet reached every corner of the kingdom, but in the halls of government, the truth had already sunk deep. Messengers arrived at Whitehall Palace, their horses trembling with cold, their faces ashen from the long ride through wind and sleet. They carried letters stamped with the red seal of France, brief, formal, and final. Calais was gone. When Queen Mary I received the news, she was sitting by the fire in her private chamber. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the stone walls. She was ill already. The wasting sickness that had plagued her for months had left her pale and shrunken. Her courtiers said she had not smiled since the autumn. Now, with the letter in her trembling hands, whatever strength she had left seemed to slip away. "Gone?" she whispered. "All gone?" The clerk bowed his head. "Yes, Your Majesty. The Duke of Guise took the town on the 7th day of January. The garrison was overwhelmed. Lord Wentworth surrendered the following morning." There was silence. The only sound was the slow ticking of the clock on the mantel. Mary stood, unsteady, and walked to the window. The sky outside was the colour of old pewter. She looked eastward, as if her gaze could stretch across the Channel, to the marshes of Calais, to the harbour she had once seen as a child. In her youth, Calais had been a point of pride. Her father, Henry VIII, had spoken of it often. the last jewel of England's claim to France, a sign that the Tudors still carried the blood of conquerors. She remembered standing beside him at the map table, tracing the coastline with his great ringed finger, as he said, "This, my daughter, is England's gate into France." And now the gate was shut. Those who were with her that day wrote that she wept quietly, not for herself, but for the crown, for what had been lost under her reign. It was not the loss of land that broke her, but the loss of continuity. For more than 200 years, Calais had been part of England's identity. It had outlived kings and rebellions, plagues and reforms. To lose it now, under her watch, felt like a personal failure, a crack in the divine order she so deeply believed in. That night, she refused her supper. The court physician urged her to rest, but she only said, "There will be no rest until I wake to find Calais returned." She knew, of course, that such a day would never come. In London, the mood turned grim. The loss of Calais struck at England's pride. Pamphlets circulated blaming poor strategy, lack of funds, and even divine punishment. Some said the Queen had focused too much on religion, on restoring the Catholic faith, and neglected the realm's defence. Others accused her husband, King Philip II of Spain, of drawing England into foreign wars that served Spanish interests, not English ones. The truth, as always, was more ordinary. Calais had been left weak through decades of neglect. Its defences were outdated, its garrison small, and its command uncertain. But none of that softened the blow. For centuries, English soldiers had called Calais the brightest jewel in the crown. Merchants had traded through its port. Nobles had owned estates there. It was England's last window onto Europe, a place where Englishmen could walk foreign streets and still hear their own tongue. Now it was gone, and with it a certain illusion of power. In Parliament, one lord stood and said what many feared to speak aloud. "We are now, sirs, an island indeed." The words lingered, heavy with foreboding. England, cut off from its last foothold on the continent, had turned inward. It would take generations before the nation looked outward again. This time, not to France, but to the oceans. At court, Queen Mary grew weaker. She rarely appeared in public, and when she did, she seemed older than her 41 years. She leaned heavily on her attendants, her hands pale and cold. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered that she spoke to herself at night, murmuring prayers for the souls of those who had died at Calais. There were few who dared to speak plainly to her, but Cardinal Pole, her closest advisor and spiritual companion, tried. He reminded her that all earthly losses were tests of faith, that God's will was mysterious, and that perhaps the loss of Calais was a sign that England should seek peace, not war. She listened, but said only, "God may test me, but he has tested England as well." Her sorrow was not simply political, it was deeply personal. Calais was the last inheritance from her father's world, from the great age of English kings who had fought and ruled across France. Its loss marked the final break between her reign and his. She had tried to restore his faith, his traditions, his alliances, but the world had moved on, and she could not move with it. There was also the matter of Philip, her husband, her king, though he had not been in England for months. He had sailed back to Spain, leaving her to govern alone. When the news of Calais reached him, he sent a letter of condolence, written in careful diplomatic phrases. "The fortune of war is uncertain, my dear wife. Let not this sorrow overtake your spirit. We will recover greater things with God's favour." But Mary saw no comfort in it. To her, Calais was not a piece on a map. It was the heart of England abroad. To lose it was to lose something that could not be recovered. As spring approached, the sickness worsened. Her physicians called it dropsy, a swelling of the body, though some whispered it was grief that filled her lungs, not water. She spent long hours in her chapel, kneeling before the altar. The courtiers grew uneasy. Without an heir, the succession would pass to her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the very woman Mary's mother had despised. The thought troubled her deeply. She had fought to restore England to Catholicism, to undo the changes of her father and brother. Now, with her death nearing, all of that seemed at risk. In November, as the leaves fell and the air turned cold again, she took to her bed. Her attendants noted that she murmured constantly. Prayers, memories, fragments of old songs. One night, she asked for her confessor. He stayed with her until dawn. When he left, his eyes were red. Not long after, she whispered her final words to a lady beside her. "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." The phrase would echo through the centuries, repeated in chronicles, histories, and plays. Some doubted she ever said it. But even if she didn't, it was true in spirit. Calais had become the symbol of her reign, the loss that defined her, the sorrow that consumed her. On November 17th, 1558, Queen Mary I died at St. James's Palace. The bells tolled across London, though few wept. Her reign had been marked by failure and fear, by religious persecution and war. Yet, for all her flaws, she had been sincere, a woman of conviction in a world that mocked conviction. When her coffin was carried to Westminster Abbey, the crowd watched in silence. The banners of England hung limp in the damp air, and somewhere beyond the grey sea, in the town she could never reclaim, the flag of France fluttered above the harbour of Calais. The age of Mary was over. But her death marked not only an ending, it opened a door. For in the quiet chambers of Hatfield House, a young woman was being told that her sister was dead, and that she, Elizabeth, was now Queen of England. And as England mourned one queen, another prepared to rise, one who would take the nation in a direction no one yet imagined. Still, the shadow of Calais lingered. Could a new ruler heal the wound that loss had left behind? Or would it remain a quiet ache beneath the surface of England's pride? When the bells of London tolled on that cold morning of November 17th, 1558, they marked not only the death of a queen, but the end of an age. The reign of Mary Tudor had been one of sorrow, a reign weighed down by war, disease, and disappointment. But in her passing, the kingdom felt something strange stirring beneath the grief, something like relief, or perhaps the faintest whisper of hope. Far from the damp streets of Westminster, at Hatfield House, a young woman sat in the garden, reading scripture when a rider approached. His cloak was wet with rain, his boots splattered with mud. He dismounted, knelt before her, and spoke simply, "Your Majesty, the Queen is dead." For a long moment, Elizabeth Tudor said nothing. She closed the book slowly and looked up through the bare branches at the grey sky. "This," she murmured, "is the Lord's doing. It is marvellous in our eyes." And so began a new chapter for England, one that would stretch for nearly half a century and change the face of the world. Yet, at the moment of her coronation, Elizabeth Moy inherited not triumph but ruin. The treasury was empty. The country was divided by religion, and across the Channel, France now held Calais, the wound that would not heal. The loss of Calais was still a raw memory. Mary's councillors had been haunted by it, and so were Elizabeth's. The Privy Council advised her to make peace quickly, to secure the borders, and to avoid new entanglements in Europe. The Queen listened carefully. She was young, only 25, but she had already learned the value of caution. Still, the shadow of Calais loomed large in every discussion. Some urged her to reclaim it, to restore England's honour. But Elizabeth, though proud, was practical. She had seen what pride had cost her sister. In her first speech to Parliament, she spoke in careful tones. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Many have remembered that line for its courage. Fewer remember what followed. "I would not spend my people's blood for the stone walls of a town that no longer calls us its own." With that, the dream of reconquering Calais quietly ended. Still, in the early years of her reign, there were murmurs, plans drawn in secret by old soldiers who had once served there. They spoke of raids, of alliances with discontented French nobles, of retaking the fortress by stealth. None of these schemes came to life. The cost was too high, the reward too small. Instead, Elizabeth's government focused on defence, fortifying the English coast from Dover to Portsmouth. The sea became the new frontier. If England could not hold land in France, then it would hold the waters between them. This shift, subtle at first, marked the beginning of England's transformation. Calais had tied England to Europe. Its loss freed her from it. No longer a continental power, England began to look outward, to Ireland, to the North Sea, and soon to the oceans beyond. But this turning point was not celebrated. It was mourned quietly. To the older generation, especially those who remembered the glories of the 100 Years' War, it felt like the end of England's greatness. In taverns and halls, men still spoke of Calais with a sigh. "We once held France," they would say. "Now we hold only ourselves." In Calais itself, life continued under French rule. The Duke of Guise's victory had brought new settlers, merchants from Normandy, soldiers' families from Picardy, priests who restored the churches to Catholic worship. The English homes were abandoned or reclaimed. Within a few years, the English language faded from its streets, yet not all memory vanished. Old stones carried old marks, English carvings on doorways, worn coats of arms on the harbour walls, graves with faint, unreadable names. Travellers who came through Calais in later years said the town had a strange air about it, neither fully French nor entirely foreign. It was as though it still remembered the centuries it had served another master. There were even whispers among fishermen that the sea near Calais was cursed, that English ghosts walked the fog at dawn, searching for ships that would take them home. Such stories were, of course, nonsense. But they reflected something true. Calais had become a ghost of England's old ambition, always visible, just across the water, yet forever out of reach. In London, the Queen's advisers debated whether the loss should be formally acknowledged. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, signed in 1559, ended England's war with France and Spain. Under its terms, France would keep Calais for 8 years, after which it was supposed to be returned to England. Few believed that clause would ever be honoured, and they were right. By the time the 8 years had passed, the matter was quietly dropped. France had no intention of giving it back, and Elizabeth had no intention of reigniting the war. Calais was gone, not lost in battle now, but buried beneath the layers of diplomacy and time. In a private letter to William Cecil, her most trusted adviser, Elizabeth wrote, "Let us not chase ghosts across the sea. England's strength lies within her shores. The world will know us not by what we hold abroad, but by what we build at home." It was a practical sentiment, but also prophetic. The young Queen's restraint spared her people another costly war and set England on a different path, one that would eventually lead to power beyond imagination. Still, in her quiet moments, Elizabeth must have thought of it. She was her father's daughter after all. And Henry VIII had dreamed of empire. Sometimes, when she looked eastward from the cliffs at Dover, she could see the faint outline of France in the distance. The horizon seemed to whisper of what had been lost. The people too felt the shift. For the first time in living memory, England had no land on the continent, no bridge between itself and the wider world. Some feared isolation, others found comfort in it. The wars of France and Spain seemed far away now, separated by the wide grey channel. Merchants turned their sails north, toward the Baltic and the Low Countries. Young explorers began to talk of voyages farther still, to the western seas, where rumours of new lands were spreading. It was as if the loss of Calais had forced England to look in a new direction, from the familiar to the unknown. And yet, the old soldiers still told stories. In alehouses, they would draw maps in spilled ale, tracing the marshes of Calais, the narrow streets, the market square where the English flag had once flown. Their children listened with wide eyes, imagining a world where England's banners had touched foreign soil. One old veteran, when asked what he remembered most, said quietly, "The wind." It was always cold there, but it smelled of home. By the 1570s, 2 decades after its fall, Calais had become a name more than a place, a reminder of England's past rather than its present. Chroniclers mentioned it in passing, poets invoked it in verse, and preachers used it as a lesson in divine providence. It became, in a sense, a moral story about pride and loss, about the danger of overreaching ambition. But beneath that moral, there was something deeper: nostalgia. For centuries, England had looked across the Channel and seen itself reflected there. Now that reflection was gone, and the island had to define itself anew. Perhaps it was inevitable. Perhaps Calais had always been a temporary possession, a memory waiting to fade. But for those who remembered, it was more than a town. It was the last echo of a dream of empire, not on the seas, but across the narrow water, a dream born in the age of knights and banners, ended in the thunder of cannon, and buried under the cold January sky of 1558. And yet, even dreams have strange ways of living on. As the young Queen Elizabeth began to build a new England, one of trade, learning, and exploration, the spirit that once clung to Calais did not die. It simply changed its shape. England had lost its last fortress in France, but it was beginning to imagine something far greater, a world where its flag might one day fly across oceans, not just across the Channel. Still, a quiet question lingered in the background, one that no treaty or triumph could quite silence. Had England truly moved forward, or was it still, in some small way, looking back across the sea toward Calais? The spring of 1559 brought with it an uneasy peace. Across Europe, cannons fell silent, soldiers returned home, and the banners that had once fluttered over muddy fields were folded away. But peace, as it so often is, came not as a triumph, but as a weary compromise. For England, newly under Queen Elizabeth II, the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis marked both an ending and a beginning. It ended the long and costly conflict inherited from her sister, Mary, a war that had drained the treasury and left the army scattered, but it also began a quiet redefinition of England's place in the world. The treaty was signed in April 1559, in the small French town of Cateau-Cambrésis, after months of negotiation between France, Spain, and England. The great powers were exhausted. The French wanted to consolidate their victories. Spain, under Philip II, sought stability to manage his far-flung empire. And Elizabeth, still only months into her reign, wanted breathing room. For her, the treaty was a necessity, not a choice. England could not afford another campaign, and the army was too weakened to defend even its own shores. She instructed her ambassador to conclude peace on the best terms possible, but everyone knew what that meant. Calais would not return. The French negotiators, led by Constable Anne de Montmorency, were shrewd. They knew Elizabeth's position was weak, but they also recognized her intelligence. Rather than humiliate her outright, they offered a symbolic concession. Under the treaty's terms, France would keep Calais for 8 years, after which it was supposed to be restored to England, provided England had not broken the peace in the meantime. If France refused, it would pay 500,000 crowns in compensation. It was a polite fiction. Both sides knew that Calais would never come back. But it allowed Elizabeth to return home, claiming honour had been preserved. When the treaty was ratified, a few in her council expressed cautious satisfaction. At least, one wrote, "We have bought peace with coin instead of blood." But among the older generation, those who remembered the long struggle for France, there was bitterness. Lord Wentworth, the man who had surrendered Calais, was still imprisoned in the Tower. Though Elizabeth had inherited him along with the war, she showed him little mercy. He was later released, but his name was stained. For many, his surrender symbolized the fading courage of England's continental ambitions. The treaty also reshaped the delicate balance of power in Europe. France emerged with greater prestige, having reclaimed Calais and secured much of northern Italy. Spain, though weary, retained dominance in the Low Countries. England, small and isolated, seemed a lesser player, an island watching the tides of empire from afar. But appearances can be deceiving. Elizabeth understood something her contemporaries did not, that peace was not weakness, but strategy. She used the years following the treaty to rebuild her navy, reform her finances, and strengthen her realm. It was during these quiet years that the Royal Navy began its slow transformation. From a scattered collection of ships into a disciplined force, the Queen ordered improvements to Portsmouth and Deptford, expanded the use of iron cannon, and encouraged the construction of smaller, faster vessels suited to defence and trade. Calais was gone, but the sea, that restless border that had once been England's vulnerability, was becoming her fortress. In time, this would change everything. The peace also had another consequence, quieter but no less profound. It gave England a moment to look inward. After years of turmoil under Henry, Edward, and Mary, the country needed stability. Elizabeth's government focused on restoring order, enforcing the new Protestant settlement, and re-establishing trade with continental ports. The merchants of London and Bristol, who had once sent goods through Calais, began to find new routes to Antwerp, Hamburg, and even distant ports in the Baltic. Trade with France never fully died, but it shifted. English cloth no longer passed through the marshy warehouses of Calais. Instead, it sailed directly to Flanders or the northern markets of Europe. In this way, the loss of Calais began to look less like an ending and more like an adaptation. The English spirit of enterprise, forced away from old paths, began to find new ones. Some historians later called this the turning tide, the moment when England began to transform from a continental outpost into a maritime power. It was not a grand decision made in court or on the battlefield, but a quiet shift in how the nation saw itself. Still, the memory of Calais lingered like an ache that refused to fade. Chroniclers continued to write about it. Preachers invoked it from their pulpits as a divine warning against pride. And travellers who crossed to France sometimes visited the town out of melancholy curiosity, writing home about the English tombs, the old walls, the traces of another age. One such traveller, an English merchant named Thomas Aldworth, visited Calais in 1564 and recorded in his journal, "There are still some who remember the English tongue. The inns are rebuilt, but the stones of the market bear marks of shot. The people say the English ghosts walk on the shore at night. I thought I heard them, though it may have been the wind." It was not superstition alone. The town truly bore scars. Deep cracks in the walls, scorched beams, and abandoned buildings left to rot. The French crown had repaired much, but traces of the siege remained, as if history itself had refused to smooth them away. Meanwhile, in London, Elizabeth's court grew brighter, full of music, poetry, and ceremony. Her reign was becoming what later generations would call a golden age, though at the time it felt more fragile than golden. At court, ambassadors from Spain and France watched closely, each hoping to draw England into alliance. Both dangled offers of marriage before the Queen, Spain's Philip II himself among them, but Elizabeth declined. She had seen what marriage had cost her sister. She would not tie England's fate to any foreign crown, and perhaps, somewhere deep within her, she remembered Calais. The town had been England's anchor on the continent, but also its chain. To rule herself, and to rule alone, Elizabeth needed England to be free of that old burden. The loss her sister had mourned became, for her, a quiet lesson. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis marked a pause in Europe's endless struggles, but it did not bring lasting calm. Within a decade, France would again fall into religious civil war. The Netherlands would rebel against Spain, and England, though distant, would find itself drawn once more into the tides of conflict. But for now, peace held, fragile, uncertain, but real. And in that stillness, England changed. Ships began to venture farther than ever before. Merchants invested in voyages to the North Atlantic. The Queen quietly encouraged explorers, men like John Hawkins and Martin Frobisher, who dreamed of trade routes beyond the known world. The energy that had once been spent defending a single stone town across the Channel was now turning outward to the open sea. In later years, historians would look back and see the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis as a dividing line, the moment when one England ended and another began. The medieval world of castles, banners, and endless wars for pieces of France was gone. In its place emerged a nation that would, in time, rule not by holding land abroad, but by mastering the waters that surrounded it. Yet even as England sailed toward that destiny, Calais remained a memory in its wake, a ghost on the horizon, half mourned, half forgiven. Sometimes, when the Queen stood at the palace windows and watched the ships in the Thames, she would speak softly, almost to herself. "We lost a town, but perhaps we gained a world." It was not a boast, more a reflection, a recognition that history often asks for one sacrifice to make room for another beginning. Still, one can imagine her wondering, in those rare quiet moments, what might have been had Calais never fallen. Would England have stayed bound to the continent, fighting old wars for old claims? Or was its loss the very thing that set the nation free? The answer, as always, lay beyond the horizon, where the tides were turning and the winds of history began to shift. The loss of Calais marked an end, but also, unknowingly, a beginning. For England, it was the last fragment of an old dream, the dream of empire across the narrow sea, inherited from the days of Edward III and Henry V, when English kings still called themselves Lords of France. When that dream faded in the smoke of Calais's fall, something new began to take its place. At first, the change was subtle. It began in ledgers, in shipyards, in the quiet hum of London's growing docks. What England had lost in land, it began to reclaim in water. The people who once thought of Calais as their bridge to Europe started to see the sea itself as their bridge to the world. Still, for many years after 1558, Calais lived on in memory. It appeared in sermons, in poetry, and in conversation, a ghost town of the English mind. There were those who could not let it go. Among them were the old soldiers who had fought in France under Mary I and Philip of Spain. Many of them returned home to find no reward, only poverty. The army had been disbanded, and those who had served in Calais were left with nothing but memories of the walls they had once defended. A pension list from 1560 records a few of their names, forgotten now, but once proud. Men like Richard Holgate, gunner, and Thomas Avery, master of stores, each granted a few shillings a month for service in the late town of Calais. It was hardly enough to live on. Some turned to labouring in shipyards or guarding the coast. Others faded quietly into parishes that scarcely remembered their names. In their tavern talk, though, they kept the memory alive. They told stories of the cold fog that rolled off the channel, the echo of cannons on the marsh, the sound of church bells from St. Nicholas before the final bombardment. Calais was England's honour, one old soldier reportedly said to a parish chronicler. We held it longer than some men hold their faith. But history, indifferent as ever, had already begun to move on. For Queen Elizabeth, the loss of Calais was both an inheritance and a caution. It reminded her of the cost of overreaching, of entangling England in wars not of its making, but it also freed her from the shadow of her forefathers. Without Calais, she was no longer bound to the dynastic claims that had drawn her ancestors into endless conflict with France. This allowed her to look elsewhere, not across the Channel, but beyond it. In council meetings, Elizabeth often listened as her advisers debated the future of England's trade. Some urged renewed ties with Antwerp and the Low Countries. Others, like Sir William Cecil, her trusted secretary, saw opportunity in the north, in the icy harbours of the Baltic and the markets of Muscovy. Out of these discussions came new ventures. The Muscovy Company, founded under her charter, opened trade routes to Russia. Soon after, the Levant Company began commerce with the Ottoman Empire. These were not the grand conquests of medieval kings, but the quiet foundations of something far more lasting: global trade. One could say then that the ghost of Calais helped push England toward the world it was destined to meet. Even in France, Calais' legacy lingered uneasily. For the French crown, Its recovery was a matter of pride, a final act of reclamation after centuries of humiliation. But pride does not fill granaries or rebuild cities. Calais, though symbolic, was also costly. Its walls needed repair, its harbour clearing, its garrison feeding. The French soon realised what the English had long endured, that Calais was both fortress and burden. Records from the reign of Henry II show increasing complaints from the Calais region. The marshlands flooded again, and the fortifications strained the royal treasury. Yet, despite the expense, the French king would not abandon his prize. "Calais," he wrote, "is worth a crown in name, if not in coin." That name carried power. It was proof that France had avenged the shame of Agincourt and Crécy, proof that the tide of history could turn. And so, while England quietly turned toward the sea, France clung proudly to the shore. In England, the scholars of Elizabeth's reign began to write a new kind of history, one that looked not backward to lost lands, but forward to new possibilities. William Camden, the antiquarian, wrote in his annals that the loss of Calais was a wound, yet one that healed clean. He suggested that it was a necessary part of England's growing independence. Even John Dee, the mathematician and navigator, argued that Calais' fall was divine providence, that it freed England to seek the true empire of the seas. Dee's maps and manuscripts, full of careful lines and celestial calculations, laid the intellectual groundwork for what would become the Age of Discovery. It is remarkable to think that within a single generation of losing its last French port, England had begun to send ships toward the Arctic, Africa, and beyond the Atlantic. The sorrow of one era became the seed of another, yet not everyone saw it that way. Among common folk, the name Calais still carried weight. In popular ballads of the late 1500s, it was remembered as a place of lost valour. One such song, The Lament of Old Calais, told of an English archer who dreamed each night of walking the walls again. The lyrics were simple, the tone mournful. "Where once I watched the dawn arise, across the misted sea, there sleeps a town of foreign skies that once belonged to me." Songs like these were sung in taverns and along the docks, half history, half nostalgia. The English people, though turning toward the future, still carried Calais in their hearts. It was no longer a fortress, but a memory, a symbol of what England had been and what it was becoming. By the late 16th century, a new generation had grown up that barely remembered the loss. The sailors who followed Drake and Hawkins across the oceans were born after Calais had fallen. To them, the wars of France were distant legends, stories of knights and banners, not the world they lived in. Their England was an island of wind and water, of ships and tides. They thought not of reclaiming Calais, but of reaching the Indies. Their maps were drawn not with borders, but with coastlines. It was in this generation that England's true transformation took hold, not a change declared by monarchs, but one made quietly by sailors, merchants, and dreamers. Still, the ghost of Calais had one last appearance to make in English life, in memory and meaning. In 1604, during the reign of James I, an English envoy passing through northern France visited Calais once again. He described it as a quiet town, its streets narrow, its people wary but peaceful. The English tombs in St. Nicholas's Church were still there, though covered with French inscriptions. The walls had been rebuilt, stronger than before. The envoy wrote in his journal, "The town is French, yet one may still feel the echo of our keeping. The stones seem to know another tongue. In the wind one might think to hear the names of men long dead. It is a haunting thought, that a place once so fiercely contested could, in time, become simply ordinary again, and perhaps that is the truest legacy of Calais. That history moves on, even from the fiercest moments of loss. What was once the heart of England's pride became in time a quiet corner of France. The walls that had seen centuries of bloodshed stood silently under the same grey sky, their purpose forgotten, their stones softened by moss. Yet, in another sense, Calais never truly disappeared. It lived on, not in conquest, but in consequence. Its fall taught England humility, resilience, and the value of looking outward rather than backward. By losing Calais, England gained a clearer sense of itself, not as a fragment of a continental empire, but as an island nation bound to the sea and to the vast unknown world that waited beyond. And perhaps that is how history always works. What seems an ending at the time is often a redirection, a turning of the tide that only centuries later reveals its purpose. As the waves still wash against the shores of Calais, one might wonder if they carry whispers of that turning, of the moment when a kingdom's loss became a world's beginning. By the early years of Elizabeth's reign, the mood of England had shifted in ways few could have predicted. Gone were the ambitions of holding castles in France, the weary marches through mud and frost, the endless feuds over who should rule Normandy or Gascony. The realm had withdrawn from that old battlefield, not out of defeat alone, but from necessity. Now, a different horizon called. The sea, once seen only as a barrier, began to look like a promise. It is strange to think that the same cold waters which once divided England from France would soon connect her to the world. Yet this is precisely what began to unfold in the years after Calais fell. There was no grand proclamation, no royal decree declaring that England should become a naval power. The transformation happened slowly, in the shipyards, in the counting houses, in the restless imaginations of men who looked out across the Channel and wondered what lay beyond. In the busy port of Deptford, hammers rang day and night. The Queen herself visited once in 1581 to knight Francis Drake aboard his ship the Golden Hind. But even before that ceremony, long before England's triumphs at sea were celebrated in ballads, the groundwork had been laid by quieter hands. Shipwrights had begun experimenting with new designs. The old heavy carracks, the kind that had once ferried English troops to Calais, were slowly replaced by sleeker, faster galleons, capable of outmaneuvering anything on the water. They were built not for the slow ferrying of soldiers, but for endurance, exploration, and trade. One naval inventory from 1565 lists the names of these early vessels: Swallow, Primrose, Lion, Greyhound. Their names evoke movement, life, and speed. Each represented a new idea of what England might be, not a kingdom bound by borders, but a nation defined by motion. The merchants of London, Bristol, and Plymouth invested heavily in these ships. Some sought new markets. Others, less scrupulous, sought new fortunes through privateering, a polite word for piracy sanctioned by royal wink. Elizabeth, careful and calculating, encouraged both. The fall of Calais had cut off England's last reliable foothold for trade with the continent. Yet this very loss forced merchants to innovate. Without a French base, they turned to the seas, searching for new ways to reach the goods and wealth of the wider world. The old merchant routes were risky. The Spanish controlled much of the Atlantic, and the Portuguese had carved their empire along the African coast. But England, small and overlooked, found opportunity in that very disadvantage. Ships began venturing into the North Atlantic, first for cod, then for exploration. There were expeditions to Iceland, then to Greenland, and attempts, brave but often tragic, to find the Northwest Passage, a route to Asia through the icy Arctic seas. Most of these voyages failed. Crews froze, ships vanished, and investors lost their fortunes. Yet each expedition, however disastrous, left behind knowledge, maps, logs, sketches of coastlines, measurements of tides and stars. And so, step by step, failure built the foundation for success. In London, meanwhile, a man named John Dee sat in his study surrounded by globes, compasses, and volumes of ancient geography. Dee was a scholar, mathematician, and occasional mystic, a man who believed that England's destiny was not on land, but on water. He coined a phrase that would echo through centuries: the British Empire of the Seas. It was an idea both visionary and oddly practical. Dee saw the sea not as a void, but as a map of invisible connections, a web of trade, knowledge, and faith that England might one day command. To him, the fall of Calais had been providential. By losing one gate, he wrote, We are given the whole horizon. In that quiet line lay the beginning of England's maritime philosophy, the belief that the ocean, vast and uncertain, could be a kingdom all its own. Even so, life on these early voyages was anything but grand. Aboard ships like the Jesus of Lubeck or the Judith, conditions were cramped and perilous. Sailors slept in hammocks slick with salt and sweat, ate hard biscuit crawling with weevils, and drank beer that soured after a week at sea. Storms were constant, scurvy a death sentence. Yet the men went willingly, driven by hunger, by curiosity, by hope of fortune or escape. Many of them were the sons of labourers or apprentices who had no land of their own. The sea offered freedom, though it came with the price of danger. They became the first generation of Englishmen whose world extended far beyond the grey coastlines of home. Their journals, when they survive, are sparse but vivid. One sailor on a voyage to Guinea in 1559 wrote, "We have sailed 6 weeks and seen naught but waves. The sea hath no mercy nor memory, yet still I feel she will give us something if we but ask rightly." There is a quiet faith in those words, not in conquest, but in endurance. By the late 1560s, the outlines of a new English world were taking shape. The Muscovy Company traded in furs and timber. The Levant Company brought silks and spices from the eastern Mediterranean. Ships returned with exotic goods that filled the stalls of London: pepper, sugar, oranges, even tobacco. These commodities reshaped not just the economy, but the imagination. The English, once preoccupied with the politics of their neighbours, began to dream of horizons they had never seen. It was not the feverish ambition of empire yet, but something gentler, a curiosity born of absence. Calais had been lost. The sea had filled the void. Elizabeth understood this intuitively. She was cautious in her support of explorers, never too open, never too committal. But she recognized that the future of her realm depended not on recovering old land, but on discovering new routes. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France and Spain watched these developments with suspicion. The Treaty of Cateau Cambrésis had brought peace on paper, but the rivalries of Europe were far from settled. To the south, Spain tightened its control over its American colonies. Galleons laden with gold and silver crossed the Atlantic, fueling an empire that seemed unstoppable. To the east, France battled internal divisions between Catholics and Huguenots. And to the north, England, quiet, cautious, but increasingly restless, began to stir. The old powers still thought of her as a small, rain-soaked island, too preoccupied with her own religion to matter much abroad. Few noticed the ships multiplying in her harbours, or the maps being drawn in candlelight by men who believed the world itself was shifting westward. History, it seems, often changes in silence. In time, these small steps toward the sea would define England's next century. The voyages that began as ventures for trade and survival would evolve into colonization and empire. The same shipwrights who built vessels for exploration would build fleets of war. The same queen who signed charters for trade would later send armadas to fight the greatest naval power of her age. But in the 1560s and 1570s, none of that was yet certain. The story was still one of learning, of small risks, of endurance, of an island rediscovering itself. If one walks today along the old docks at Deptford or Plymouth, where the timbers of those early ships once stood, the river still smells of tar and salt, the echoes of those hammers, of those men who turned from lost lands to new waters, still seem to linger. Their work began not in glory, but in recovery, the quiet rebuilding that follows a fall. And so, from the ashes of Calais, England found her compass, not pointing back to France, but outward, toward the unknown, toward the horizon, toward the wide and waiting sea. It is easy now to see that moment as destiny, but in truth, it was something humbler, an act of survival. A nation that had lost its last foothold on foreign soil found steadiness in the waves instead. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Calais. Not the sorrow of what was taken, but the courage to look beyond what was lost. In that sense, every tide that left the English shore carried with it a quiet echo of that transformation. The end of one world and the beginning of another. And as the gulls circled above the channel and the wind rose again from the west, it seemed that England, once defined by what it could hold, was learning instead to be defined by what it could reach. When England turned its gaze from the lost stones of Calais to the restless expanse of the Atlantic, the men who led the way were not kings or noblemen, but sailors. They were restless, ambitious, and often desperate. The kind of men drawn to the edge of maps, where the ink fades and imagination begins. The first English voyagers of Elizabeth's reign were traders, privateers, and adventurers all at once. They came from coastal towns like Plymouth, Bristol, and Portsmouth, places that smelled of pitch and brine. These ports were worlds of their own, filled with gossip of foreign lands, the clatter of shipwrights' hammers, and the sigh of waves against timber hulls. For generations, these men had ferried wool and tin to Flanders or Bordeaux, hugging the familiar coasts of Europe. But now, with Calais gone and continental trade unstable, they began to venture farther, first cautiously, then boldly, into the open sea. What they sought was not conquest, at least not yet. They sought opportunity, new markets, new routes, new beginnings. But as they followed these winds, they stumbled into something far greater, the beginning of England's story as a maritime power. One of the earliest of these voyagers was John Hawkins, a merchant's son from Plymouth. Born in 1532, he grew up listening to sailors' tales of the Spanish Main, that glittering stretch of the Caribbean where gold flowed from the New World to Spain. By the 1560s, Hawkins had built his own small fleet and was trading, or raiding, depending on who told the story, along the African and American coasts. He made his fortune through ventures that history would later judge harshly: the slave trade, transporting captured Africans to the Spanish colonies. At the time, such commerce was seen less as moral failure than as daring enterprise. Hawkins's voyages were dangerous, and several nearly ended in disaster. But they brought back something England had not known in decades: wealth. And with wealth came attention. In 1564, Hawkins's first successful voyage returned to England laden with gold, pearls, and sugar. The profits were enormous, and soon investors, even courtiers, began to take notice. Among them was Queen Elizabeth herself, who quietly financed his later expeditions. When Hawkins sailed again in 1567, it was with royal ships, Jesus of Lubeck and Minion, and with a young kinsman aboard, Francis Drake. Drake was everything that England's new age of exploration required: ambitious, unyielding, and full of quiet fury. He had grown up poor, the son of a Protestant preacher, and had served as an apprentice on a coastal barge. The sea was his education, and he learned quickly. The 1567 voyage with Hawkins would shape him forever. What began as a trading expedition soon turned into survival. At San Juan de Ulua, off the coast of modern Mexico, Hawkins's fleet was trapped by the Spanish, who accused the English of piracy. In a sudden, brutal attack, Spanish ships opened fire, killing hundreds. The Jesus of Lubeck was wrecked. Hawkins and Drake barely escaped, limping home with only 2 battered ships. The experience burned into Drake a hatred for Spain, one that would define his life. Years later, he would call the sea God's battlefield, and himself one of his instruments. These first voyages were not yet the grand triumphs of later years. They were experiments and often failures. Ships were lost to storms, to mutiny, to hunger. Navigational tools were crude: an hourglass, a quadrant, a compass trembling in the wind. A sailor's life could end in silence, somewhere between waves and stars. Yet every failure brought home knowledge. Maps improved, tides were measured, the edges of the world grew clearer. It's easy to forget that before these men sailed, the Atlantic was still a mystery. The English had only second-hand tales from Portuguese pilots or Spanish charts guarded like state secrets. Each voyage that left Plymouth Harbour was, in some sense, a step into darkness. And yet, they kept going, because they believed, in that stubborn English way, that the sea would eventually yield its answers and its treasures. Back in London, the Queen's Court buzzed with conflicting feelings about these expeditions. Some ministers, like Lord Burghley, William Cecil, were cautious, preferring peace with Spain. Others, including younger courtiers and adventurers, saw the voyages as a new kind of war, one that could be waged with sails instead of soldiers. Elizabeth herself walked a careful line. She rarely gave open approval to privateering or piracy, but she did not forbid it either. When ships returned rich with Spanish gold, she accepted her share of the profits with regal composure and few questions. In one letter from 1573, an observer wrote, "The Queen smileth upon such enterprises, so long as their gain is hers, and their blame is theirs." It was a delicate balance, diplomacy in one hand, opportunity in the other. But behind the political games, something deeper was changing. For the first time in centuries, England's wealth was coming not from the soil, but from the sea. The first voyagers were also the first to bring home glimpses of worlds the English had only imagined. Tropical islands where trees bore fruit unknown in Europe, rivers so wide they seemed like oceans, peoples whose lives followed rhythms utterly foreign to those of Europe. Their journals, though filtered through curiosity and prejudice, expanded the English sense of scale. The world was suddenly larger, and England, by contrast, seemed smaller. That smallness bred ambition. It was no longer enough to be an island at the edge of Europe. The new generation of Englishmen, sailors, investors, poets, and prophets, began to dream of building something greater, something that stretched beyond the horizon. They spoke of plantations and colonies, of discovering lands not yet possessed. It was the beginning of empire, though none yet knew what that word would come to mean. In the harbours of Plymouth, you could feel it. A quiet restlessness, a pull toward the unknown. Men mended sails and whispered of voyages to come. Shipwrights worked by lantern light, hammering together the frames of vessels that would one day circle the globe. The memory of Calais, though fading, still lingered like a lesson. The old England, the one that fought for pieces of France, had been bound by walls and borders. The new England was learning to think in currents and winds. What had once been a defeat was becoming a direction. Even the sea seemed to acknowledge it. The same channel that had once divided England from her continental past now carried her toward her oceanic future. It is said that on clear mornings, the fishermen of Dover could still see the French coast, a narrow line of grey on the horizon, but fewer and fewer of them cared to look. Their eyes were turned west, not east. In those early years of voyaging, the risks were greater than the rewards. For every ship that returned with silver or spices, another vanished without trace. The names of lost vessels were recorded in parish registers: the Mary Fortune, the Star of Hope, the Sea Venture, each a small tragedy swallowed by the waves. And yet, for those who survived, the sea offered something that no Englishman had ever known before: a sense of purpose larger than the island itself. For centuries, England's story had been about borders, about keeping invaders out or claiming land abroad. Now, the story was about roots, about reaching, connecting, venturing. It was a shift not just in geography, but in identity. The English were no longer merely defenders of a small grey realm. They were becoming navigators of a wider world. Looking back, it's tempting to imagine these early voyages as grand or romantic. But to those who lived them, they were often cold, wet, and uncertain, the daily labour of men who trusted their lives to wood, rope, and the mercy of weather. And yet, those men changed history, not through conquest or invention, but through persistence, through the stubborn belief that the horizon was not an end, but a beginning. That belief, once kindled, would carry England across oceans, into centuries of exploration and empire, both glorious and terrible. But in the 1560s and 1570s, it was still only a whisper in the wind, rising from the docks of Plymouth, drifting across the channel where Calais had once stood. A whisper that said, "The world is waiting." And so the first voyagers set their sails, not knowing that in losing a fortress, England had found her destiny. For all the brave talk in Elizabeth's England of discovery and destiny, the truth was this: the seas already belonged to Spain. From the Straits of Gibraltar to the shores of Mexico, the Spanish flag flew over waters that shimmered with gold and power. Their fleets crossed the Atlantic in stately convoys. The treasure fleets they were called, carrying the riches of the New World home to Seville and Cadiz. Every year, ships heavy with silver from Potosi, emeralds from Colombia, and spices from the Indies made Spain the wealthiest kingdom on earth. The world that the English dreamed of exploring was already mapped, claimed, and guarded. The Spanish Empire, under King Philip II, was the mightiest in history, its influence stretching from Europe to the Americas, across Africa, and into the Pacific. The sun, as people like to say, never set upon it. And yet, beneath that golden surface, shadows lengthened. When Mary Tudor had died and Elizabeth had taken her place, the bond between England and Spain had broken like a strained rope. King Philip, once England's husband and protector, was now its rival. The marriage that had united two crowns had ended in mistrust and quiet resentment. Philip watched Elizabeth's rule with unease. She was Protestant, cautious, and fiercely independent, everything Mary had not been. Worse, Elizabeth refused to marry him or any other European prince. Her England was turning inward and outward, both at once, rejecting continental entanglements while seeking fortunes across the sea. Spain saw this with alarm. English ships were beginning to appear where they did not belong, near the Canary Islands, off the coasts of Africa, and, most provocatively, in the Caribbean, Spain's private ocean. To the Spanish crown, this was nothing less than trespass, or piracy. In those years, pirate and privateer were words separated only by paper. A pirate sailed for himself. A privateer sailed under a royal license, called a letter of marque, which made his plunder legal, at least in his own country. Elizabeth was too shrewd to issue such licenses openly, but she knew how to look the other way. When Francis Drake and John Hawkins returned from their perilous voyages with tales of gold and Spanish treachery, the Queen's anger, real or well performed, gave way to curiosity. She began to see in these men not criminals, but instruments. The Spanish had their empire. England had its seamen. And in those years of fragile peace, the English began to test the boundaries of Spain's patience and its power. Drake's revenge began quietly in 1572 when he set out on one of his most daring expeditions to raid the Spanish treasure trains near Nombre de Dios on the Isthmus of Panama. The plan was madness. He had only 73 men and 2 small ships. The Spanish had fortresses, cannons, and soldiers. But Drake was driven by something beyond reason, the memory of betrayal and the dream of redemption. The journey was brutal. They hid in jungles, were drenched by tropical rains, stalked by disease and snakes. But they reached the treasure route, and one night, under a sky thick with stars, they ambushed a train of mules laden with silver. They captured enough to make every man rich for life. Drake, standing on a hill above the Caribbean, looked out over the glimmering sea and is said to have sworn, "I have now seen the Pacific, and by the grace of God, I will one day sail upon her." He would keep that promise. When Drake returned to England, the Queen received him in secret. He could not be honoured openly. Spain was still nominally a friend. But Elizabeth rewarded him quietly with gold and her favour. From that moment, Drake was more than a sailor. He was a weapon. Spain, of course, knew what was happening. Its ambassadors wrote bitter letters from London demanding the punishment of English corsairs. Philip II was patient, but not blind. He saw England as a splinter in his side, a heretic nation, ruled by a queen who refused obedience to Rome and allowed her subjects to rob Spain on the high seas. And so, a shadow began to stretch across Elizabeth's realm. The growing fear that Spain might one day turn its fleets, not just to guard its treasure, but to seek revenge. The Queen's counsellors knew it too. They began to prepare quietly, building ships, training men, and gathering intelligence. But England, small and poor compared to Spain, could not hope to fight in the old way, with great armies or fortresses. Its defence would be made of wood and wind. The Royal Navy, which had once been a neglected collection of transport ships, was beginning to change. New designs appeared, sleeker, faster, built for manoeuvre rather than mass. The idea was not to match Spain ship for ship, but to outthink and outrun them. As the Spanish shadow grew, so too did the English confidence that perhaps, just perhaps, the sea could be their equalizer. In these years, London was alive with rumour. At the docks, sailors swapped tales of hidden Spanish cities, of Inca gold, of jungles filled with parrots and danger. Merchants calculated risks and profits. Preachers thundered about divine favour, that God had placed England on its island perch to challenge the pride of Rome and Spain alike. Even poets joined in. Men like Richard Hakluyt, the geographer, began to compile stories of voyages and discoveries. His great work, The Principal Navigations, collected every English journey he could find, binding them into a single vision, that England's destiny lay upon the sea. Hakluyt wrote of Drake and Hawkins as heroes, but also of humbler men, fishermen, merchants, explorers of frozen waters near the Arctic. To him, every voyage was part of a divine tapestry. England's loss of Calais had not been a curse, but a calling. And yet, beneath this growing confidence, the danger was real. Spain's power was vast, and its king relentless. Philip II was not a man of passion, but of purpose. He saw himself as God's chosen ruler, destined to defend the true faith against heresy. England, with its Protestant queen and its piratical sailors, was an insult he could not forever ignore. By the late 1570s, Spain's patience was fraying. Reports of English raids multiplied. Drake, now a living legend, struck again, this time not near Panama, but across the world. In 1577, he began what would become one of the greatest journeys in history, the circumnavigation of the globe. Under orders too vague to be denied and too bold to be confessed, Drake sailed west in the Golden Hind, attacking Spanish outposts along the coast of South America, capturing ships and eventually reaching the Pacific, the sea he had once sworn to see. He plundered Spanish towns in Chile and Peru, seized a ship loaded with treasure off Ecuador, and crossed the vast Pacific to the Philippines. After 3 years, he returned home by way of the Indian Ocean and around the Cape of Good Hope, his ship groaning with gold and spices. When he finally dropped anchor at Deptford in 1580, he had done what no Englishman before him had imagined possible. Queen Elizabeth came to see the Golden Hind herself. In a quiet ceremony, she knighted him on its deck. Spain, furious, demanded his punishment, but Elizabeth only smiled and called him "my dear pirate." From that moment, there was no doubt that war would come. Drake's circumnavigation was not just an adventure, it was a declaration. England had entered Spain's ocean and survived. Philip II began his preparations in earnest. Across the docks of Cadiz and Lisbon, shipwrights built galleons. Cannons were cast, soldiers gathered, priests blessed banners embroidered with the Virgin's image. Spain would build a fleet that would crush England once and for all, the Armada, as it would later be known. But that, as yet, was a storm on the horizon. For now, in the early 1580s, England lived under the long shadow of Spain, fearful, fascinated, and quietly determined. Elizabeth knew that the day would come when all diplomacy would fail, when her island would have to stand alone against the might of empire. But she also knew something Philip did not. England's greatest weapon was not its strength, but its spirit, a spirit born from loss, tempered by endurance, and carried now by the wind and tide. The Spanish shadow darkened England's shores, but it also sharpened its resolve. Soon, that shadow would take shape in sails upon the horizon. And when it did, the fate of nations would be decided not on land, but upon the sea. For years, it had been a rumour whispered in taverns and at court, a thing spoken of, but not seen. But by 1586, the rumours began to take form. In the harbours of Spain, something vast was stirring. In Lisbon, Cadiz, and Coruña, carpenters worked from dawn until dusk, their hammers echoing across the docks. Great oak hulls took shape upon the slips, galleons, galleasses, hulks, and pataches, each designed to bear soldiers, cannon, and the weight of divine purpose. King Philip II had decided at last. England must be invaded, her queen dethroned, and her people returned to the Catholic faith. For a man of his temperament, this was no rash act of vengeance. Philip was deliberate, even slow. He prayed, consulted, revised, and planned with the precision of a clerk and the conviction of a crusader. The enterprise would not be merely a war, it would be a holy mission, a judgment delivered by wind and fire. Philip called his creation the Gran Armada Invencible, the Great and Invincible Armada. It was to be the largest naval force ever assembled by a single nation. Over 130 ships, carrying nearly 30,000 men, would sail from Spain to the English Channel. Their orders were clear: rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Low Countries, some 20,000 veterans of Spain's continental wars, and together cross into England. The plan was a masterpiece of theory and impossibility. The Armada would control the channel long enough for Parma's barges to make the crossing. Once landed, Spanish troops would march on London. England's defences, scattered, poorly supplied, and untested, would crumble before them. Philip imagined it as an act of divine restoration. In his mind, England's rebellion against Rome was a wound that had festered too long. He would heal it with force. But on the other side of the Channel, England was watching. Elizabeth's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, had built one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in Europe. Letters intercepted, couriers bribed, servants turned. The news of Spain's preparations reached London long before the ships were ready to sail. The Queen's Council met in tense secrecy. Lord Burleigh, the ageing statesman, urged caution. Walsingham pressed for preemptive strikes. Drake, predictably, preferred action. England could not hope to match Spain ship for ship. Its advantage, if any, lay in speed, in striking first, and striking hard. So in 1587, Elizabeth gave her reluctant consent to a daring plan. Drake would sail to Cadiz, where much of the Armada's supply fleet lay at anchor, and singe the King of Spain's beard. It was a phrase that would become legend. In April of that year, Drake appeared suddenly off Cadiz with a small English squadron. The Spanish were caught entirely unprepared. For 2 days and nights, Drake's ships bombarded the harbour, setting fire to galleons, warehouses, and stores of timber and pitch. Over 30 Spanish vessels were destroyed or captured. When the smoke cleared, the docks of Cadiz were blackened and silent. Drake had bought England something priceless: time. The Armada, delayed by the loss of supplies and repairs, would not sail that year. But he also did something more. He showed Spain that England could strike at its heart and escape. The invincible empire, for the first time, had been burned by a handful of heretics and privateers. Philip was furious, but undeterred. He redoubled his efforts. The Armada would sail the next year, larger, better supplied, and guided by faith. In the spring of 1588, the final preparations began. Across Spain's coastal cities, ships were fitted with sails and cannon. Chaplains preached sermons on divine victory. Artists painted banners of the Virgin Mary to hang from the rigging. Soldiers prayed and confessed, believing themselves part of God's army upon the sea. The fleet was commanded by Don Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a nobleman of impeccable loyalty, but limited experience at sea. His selection was, as some at Philip's court quietly noted, unfortunate. Medina Sidonia had little appetite for the task. In his letters to the king, he confessed seasickness, anxiety, and a sense of doom. But Philip was unmoved. The Duke's duty was obedience. And so, on May 20th, 1588, the Armada sailed from Lisbon, its masts rising like a forest above the water. Witnesses on shore described it as a floating city, magnificent and terrible. The Spanish sailors sang hymns, the priests blessed the decks, cannon thundered in salute. It was, in every sense, a sight meant to awe and to frighten. England's response was one of grim readiness. The beacons that lined the southern coast, relics of earlier centuries, were inspected, repaired, and watched night and day. Supplies of gunpowder were gathered in London, Portsmouth, and Plymouth. The English fleet was commanded by Lord Charles Howard of Effingham, a cautious but competent leader, assisted by Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher, men who knew the sea as intimately as others knew Scripture. Their ships were smaller than Spain's but swifter, their guns longer ranged, their tactics more flexible. Still, when word came that the Armada had finally sailed, England trembled. Elizabeth's court prepared to flee inland if the enemy landed. Sermons urged repentance. Farmers hid their daughters and their silver. The fear was not merely of invasion, but of retribution. The return of the old faith, the old rulers, and the old chains. Then, on July 19th, the news arrived. The Armada had been sighted off the Lizard Peninsula. The beacons were lit. From Cornwall to Kent, the chain of fire leapt from hill to hill, 1,000 points of light racing across the night sky, carrying a single message. They are here. Drake, playing a game of bowls at Plymouth, famously refused to rush. "There is time," he said, "to finish the game and beat the Spaniards afterward." It was likely a dramatized legend, but it captured the spirit of the hour. Calm resolve in the face of impossible odds. For the next week, the two fleets danced through the Channel. The Spanish ships, vast and heavy, held their formation, a crescent of power. The English, darting like wasps, harried them from a distance, firing and withdrawing before the Spanish could close. Gunpowder filled the air. The sea was thick with splinters and smoke. At Plymouth, Portland, and the Isle of Wight, the English attacked, then retreated, preserving their strength. They could not destroy the Armada outright, but they could wear it down. And all the while, the weather turned against Spain. Winds shifted, currents dragged ships off course, provisions spoiled, men fell sick. Medina Sidonia struggled to keep his fleet together. Messages to the Duke of Parma failed to arrive. Fog and interception saw to that. The great rendezvous that Philip had planned never came. The Armada, hungry and battered, drifted north, toward Calais. There, in the waters that had once been England's pride, the final confrontation would begin. On the night of August 7th, the English unleashed a weapon of fear rather than fire. 8 fireships, old vessels packed with tar, pitch, and gunpowder, set ablaze and sent drifting into the anchored Spanish fleet. The sight was chaos incarnate. Burning masts, exploding decks, men shouting in terror as chains were cut and anchors abandoned. The Armada scattered in panic. When dawn came, the English struck. At Gravelines, they closed in and fired broadside after broadside, their guns hammering the enemy until several galleons sank or ran aground. It was not a single decisive battle, but a steady unravelling. By the time the smoke cleared, the Armada was broken. Driven by storm and confusion, the survivors fled north, past Scotland, past Ireland, chased by gales and hunger. Dozens of ships were wrecked upon foreign shores. The Great Armada, the invincible fleet, had become a ghostly procession of ruin. When news reached London, the bells rang for days. Elizabeth, in her silver breastplate and white horse, addressed her troops at Tilbury, declaring that she had the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. Her words, remembered and repeated, became the anthem of a nation reborn in courage. The shadow of Spain had been lifted. not by conquest, but by endurance. Yet, even then, the Queen and her council knew that victory was only the beginning. Spain was not defeated forever. Philip's power remained vast, but something had changed irrevocably. England, the island that had once clung to Calais, had now held its own against the greatest empire on earth. The wind, the sea, and the courage of its people had carried it through. Still, one quiet question lingered, even in triumph. Was it providence or merely chance that saved England's fragile crown? When the guns fell silent and the sea returned to its endless rhythm, the scale of what had happened began to reveal itself. The Spanish Armada, that vast floating cathedral of faith and empire, no longer existed as a fleet. It existed as fragments, splintered hulls, drowned men, and wreckage scattered across the coasts of northern Europe. The English called it God's wind. The Spaniards called it La Fortuna. To both, it seemed that nature itself had chosen a side. After the battle off Gravelines, the Armada had fled northward, battered and bleeding. Medina Sidonia, its weary commander, had no choice. His ships were low on food, their ammunition nearly gone. The English fleet harried them as far as the Firth of Forth, then turned back, content to let wind and wave finish what cannon had begun. The Spaniards still hoped to find safe harbour, perhaps in Norway or Ireland. But the North Sea was no friend to southern sailors. The wind, steady and cold, drove them onward, not home, but into a cruel spiral of storms that circled the coasts of Scotland and Ireland through the late summer of 1588. Many ships, never built for such weather, simply broke apart. Their masts splintered, their sails shredded, their rudders gone. The men prayed and bailed until their hands bled. They sang hymns as the waves closed over them. For every galleon that limped back to Spain, another was lost, dashed upon hidden rocks, or buried beneath grey surf. The Irish coast became a graveyard. At Streido Strand, 3 great ships went down together, La Lavia, La Juliana, and Santa Maria de Vizon. Their survivors staggered ashore, starved and wounded, only to meet new horrors. Ireland was then under English rule, and any Spaniard found alive was considered an invader. Local officials were ordered to execute them without trial. Some Irish villagers, bound by old Catholic sympathies, hid the wrecked sailors, fed them, and guided them inland. Others, fearful of English reprisal, turned them over or plundered what little they carried. One Spanish officer wrote, before he was captured, that Ireland was the most pitiful land of all, for it offers food and death in the same hour. Of the more than 130 ships that had sailed, fewer than half returned. Perhaps 20,000 men were dead, drowned, executed, or simply vanished. The survivors who staggered back to Spain were gaunt shadows of the soldiers who had left. Many ships arrived empty, their decks carpeted with corpses. The ports of Coruña and Santander filled with the sound of mourning. Mothers searched for sons who would never return. Priests gave last rites to heaps of the unrecognizable. In Madrid, King Philip II received the news with the stillness of a man carved from stone. When courtiers wept, he said only, "I sent my ships to fight against the English, not against the wind and the waves." It was a rare admission, not of defeat, but of powerlessness. For all his planning, his faith, and his empire, the world had reminded him of its limits. Philip ordered prayers of thanksgiving rather than lamentation. In his mind, the loss was a test of endurance, not an end. He would rebuild, and indeed, within a year, Spanish shipyards were busy again. A second armada, smaller but formidable, was prepared, though it too would meet storms before ever reaching England's shores. Spain remained rich, vast, and devout. But the illusion of invincibility was gone. In England, the reaction was very different. For a brief moment, the country rejoiced, as if it had been reborn. Bells rang, bonfires blazed, sermons thundered of divine favour. Elizabeth herself walked through the cheering crowds, her white gown bright against the smoke-stained air. To many, She was no longer merely queen. She was the living symbol of providence, the woman who had faced the might of empire and survived. But beneath the joy lay exhaustion. The war had drained England's treasury, disrupted trade, and strained its people. The fleet that had defended the realm was still at sea, hungry and unpaid. Disease swept through the sailors' camps at Margate and Chatham. Hundreds of men who had saved their nation now died of hunger and fever on English soil. The Queen, ever cautious with coin, delayed their payment. In the end, many were buried in unmarked graves, their names forgotten, even as the preachers spoke of victory. The irony was sharp. England had triumphed by endurance, yet seemed unable to care for those who endured. The material aftermath of the Armada was both mundane and monumental. Along the coast, wreckage washed ashore for months. Carved figureheads, barrels of gunpowder, splintered beams, even corpses tangled in seaweed. Villagers gathered what they could use: nails, wood, iron fittings. Children played among the debris of empire. In some places, local craftsmen made furniture from the timbers of Spanish ships: a chair, a chest, a door, all made from wood that once bore men to war. In London, the Victory became a thing of art and pageantry. Painters captured scenes of Elizabeth at Tilbury, of Drake at his maps, of storms battering golden galleons. The image of the Armada entered the national imagination, a story retold in woodcuts, sermons, and songs. Yet even then, the English knew how narrow their escape had been. Had the wind blown differently, had Palmer's army crossed the Channel, or had Drake's fireships failed to scatter the fleet, the story might have ended otherwise. So the celebration carried a quiet humility too, the sense that history's greatest outcomes often depend on chance, on weather, or on the choices of a few tired men. The sea itself kept its secrets. For centuries, fishermen along the Irish coast told of cannonballs caught in their nets, of anchors buried in sand, of ghosts seen walking the beaches on stormy nights. The wrecks of the Armada slept beneath the waves, untouched, until modern divers found them centuries later, their bronze guns still bearing the royal arms of Spain, their timbers preserved by salt and silence. Each fragment told the same story, of ambition undone by nature, of courage swallowed by the deep. It was, in its way, the perfect English story, not of conquest, but of survival. Yet even survival has a cost. The victory over Spain did not end the danger. It only began a new era of vigilance. England now lived under the expectation that more armadas would come, that the price of independence was eternal readiness. The war with Spain would continue, on and off, for nearly 20 years more. In Ireland, in the Netherlands, and across the Atlantic. Ships would sail, fortunes would be lost and won, and the wind would remain England's most faithful ally. The myth of the invincible Armada began to harden into something larger. The belief that England was chosen, not merely lucky, but favoured. That its survival was proof of divine purpose. This quiet confidence would grow, shaping the island's identity for centuries, through empire, war, and discovery. From the wreckage of Spanish ambition, England began to build its own. On the shores of Spain, widows mourned and shipwrights hammered. In the chapels of London, choristers sang Te Deum in thanksgiving. And between them, the grey sea rolled as it always had, vast, indifferent, and eternal. History had turned, not by armies or kings, but by weather and will. And so, as the wind faded and calm returned to the Channel, one question lingered softly in the minds of those who survived. Was it truly the hand of God that guided the storm? Or was it merely the wind remembering whose island this had always been? The year was 1589, and the winds that had wrecked the Spanish Armada were still whispering along England's shores. Yet already, new sails were rising on the horizon, not of war, but of ambition. England had survived, but survival alone was never enough. In the wake of the storm, the island's imagination began to stretch outward. Beyond the fog and the cliffs, there was a world to be found and taken. The defeat of Spain's Armada had not only saved England from invasion, It had freed her to dream. In London, merchants gathered in smoky taverns along the Thames, their tables covered with maps and mugs of ale. They traced routes across the Atlantic, murmuring names that sounded half like prayers and half like promises: Virginia, Roanoke, the Indies, Cathay. These were not yet empires, only ideas, fragile and improbable. But in those late Tudor years, England's merchants, sailors, and poets began to speak of destiny. If Spain could build a new world, they reasoned, why not England? The Queen herself encouraged such talk, carefully, for she had no wish to provoke Spain again. But Elizabeth understood that the future of her island lay not in continental wars, but upon the sea. "The realm of England," wrote one chronicler, "is a world itself, yet not content to be contained." The sea captains of the 1580s were a new kind of man, part soldier, part trader, part pirate. Francis Drake, though older and slower now, still loomed large in legend. He had circled the globe, plundered Spanish treasure, and returned with more gold than any Englishman before him. John Hawkins built ships and trained sailors, turning the rough mariners of Devon and Plymouth into a professional navy, and others followed. Thomas Cavendish, Martin Frobisher, Walter Raleigh, men who looked at the map not as a limit, but as an invitation. They sailed for riches, for faith, for fame, but most of all, for the restless sense that England's story was only just beginning. The world itself was changing too. While Spain and Portugal ruled vast territories in the Americas and Asia, their empires were growing heavy, burdened by bureaucracy, rebellion, and greed. Their galleons sailed slower, their soldiers grew complacent. England, by contrast, was nimble, curious, and poor enough to be hungry. Its sailors studied the winds and tides. Its printers filled the streets with new books about navigation, astronomy, and strange lands. Its poets, men like Edmund Spenser and Philip Sidney, wrote of exploration as both physical and spiritual conquest. In the taverns of London, sailors bragged of cannibals, gold, and monsters. In the courts of Europe, diplomats whispered that the English had become mad with sea dreams. They weren't wrong. One of those dreams took the form of a small, doomed colony, Roanoke, founded by Sir Walter Raleigh on the coast of North America. In 1585, ships landed there carrying a few dozen settlers. They built wooden houses among the dunes, planted gardens, and waited for supply ships that never came. When the English finally returned years later, they found only silence. The settlement was deserted, its walls weathered and empty. The word Croatoan was carved into a post, a clue or a curse. No one ever discovered what became of them. And yet, even in failure, Roanoke became legend, proof that England's gaze had shifted westward, that her destiny was no longer bound to the European shore. By the turn of the century, England's confidence was something almost mystical. The poets of Elizabeth's court began to write of the island as blessed, chosen by Providence for a higher purpose. In The Fairy Queen, Spenser imagined England as a land of virtue destined to overcome corruption. The preacher John Dee, mathematician, mystic, and advisor to Elizabeth, coined the term the British Empire. He saw in England not just a nation, but the seed of a global order guided by divine light. He believed that to sail west was not merely exploration, it was prophecy. The Queen, ever cautious, wrapped these dreams in poetry and prayer. She spoke of peace and prosperity, but her actions quietly prepared for empire. She strengthened the navy, expanded trade routes, and encouraged the founding of new trading companies, ventures that would one day rule continents. The Muscovy Company sent ships north, across the Arctic seas, seeking routes to Russia. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, began its first voyages toward the distant ports of Asia, to lands of spice, silk, and silver. These were not armies, but merchants. And yet behind them sailed the shadow of the English crown. Elizabeth would not live to see the empire her reign had inspired. In 1603, the Queen, who had ruled for 45 years, lay dying in her chamber at Richmond. She was old, tired, and childless. When her ministers asked her to name her successor, she whispered a single word: King of Scots. And so James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns and marking the birth of a new nation, Great Britain. The Virgin Queen was gone, but the dreams she had nurtured did not die with her. In her place rose a restless, expanding people, driven by trade, curiosity, and a quiet conviction that the world was theirs to know. The Spanish Empire, once unshakable, began to fracture under its own weight. Its gold from the Americas fueled inflation rather than prosperity. Its soldiers fought endless wars in the Netherlands and Italy. Its faith, once a source of unity, became a burden of intolerance. Spain slept, dreaming of its past glories. England, meanwhile, stayed awake. The island that had once feared invasion now sent out its own fleets, first to trade, then to conquer, then to rule. It was not yet the vast empire of later centuries, but the foundations were being laid, in the hum of London's docks, the creak of shipyards, and the whispered prayers of men staring westward from the cliffs. They said England was an empire that never slept, an island that dreamed even while awake. Its sailors dreamed of new worlds, its poets dreamed of immortality, its merchants dreamed of gold, and behind them all, the sea, always the sea, carried their dreams outward, beyond the reach of kings and popes. The same wind that had once destroyed the Armada now filled English sails, propelling them toward an empire of trade, of colonies, of oceans. No one yet knew what that empire would become, or what it would cost. But for now, in the twilight after storm and triumph, England stood awake while the rest of Europe slept. An empire was being born, quietly, inexorably, not in conquest, but in curiosity. The waves that had wrecked the proudest fleet in the world had done more than protect a kingdom. They had changed the course of history. For from that wreckage rose something far greater than a victory, a belief that the world itself could be mapped, mastered, and remade. The wind that once scattered the Armada now whispered a new story, not of defence, but of destiny. When Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, a strange stillness fell over England, as if the island itself paused to breathe. The age of the Tudors had ended, but their legacy was not silence, it was motion. The new king, James I, inherited not just a throne, but an awakening, a restless hum of merchants, sailors, thinkers, and dreamers who had begun to look outward. England had once been a medieval kingdom, concerned with borders and dynasties. Now, under the gaze of a new century, it was becoming something far different, a nation of the sea. In London, the Thames flowed like an artery of empire. Along its banks stood the timbered warehouses of the East India Company, founded only 3 years before Elizabeth's death. Its ships were already sailing to distant ports, Surat, Bantam, and the Spice Islands, where nutmeg and pepper were worth more than gold. Each voyage was perilous. The maps were incomplete, the winds uncertain, the diseases strange, but profit whispered louder than fear. Every returning ship brought back stories of coral seas and strange fruits, of people with customs unlike anything known in Europe. Sailors spoke of a world so vast that it could not possibly be contained within any single kingdom's grasp. And yet, England meant to try. It was not war that spread England's reach in these early years, but trade, patient, relentless, and often dull. The merchants who built this empire were not heroes in armour. They were clerks and navigators, men with ink-stained fingers and ledgers full of numbers. They wrote down cargo lists, spices, indigo, silk, porcelain, tobacco, sugar. Each entry, dry as dust, carried with it the shadow of 1,000 lives. The sailors who loaded the ships, the dock workers who unloaded them, the farmers and labourers half a world away who produced what Europe now craved. An empire was growing quietly in the margins of paperwork. The English were learning to navigate not only by the stars, but by time itself. Aboard every long voyage, The sailors kept strict logs, recording latitude, longitude, as best they could guess it, and the position of the sun each day. They charted currents, tides, and reefs with a patience born of survival. To sail without precision meant death, so the compass became more than a tool. It was a symbol, a quiet miracle of metal and magnetism that pointed north even when men were lost. At night, the helmsman steered by the pole star, steady and cold in the black sky. By day, the sun itself became their clock, its height above the horizon marking their place upon the globe. Every voyage was a conversation between man and nature. The whisper of wind against sail, the rhythm of waves beneath hull, the faint creak of rope and timber. It was not romantic. It was weary, repetitive, and often desperate. And yet, in that monotony, the world began to shrink. Back home, London changed with every returning tide. Coffee houses began to appear, small, smoky rooms where merchants gathered to trade news and speculate on ships still months away. There, men read the latest pamphlets about voyages to India, or stories of Dutch and Portuguese traders who had died of fever in tropical ports. There were rumours of islands where nutmeg grew wild, or of strange metals found in the mountains of Peru. Knowledge became currency. In those coffee-scented rooms, global trade was born, not through conquest, but through conversation. For all their ambition, the English were still newcomers to empire. The Dutch dominated the East Indies with ruthless efficiency. The Spanish ruled the Americas with an iron faith. The Portuguese, though fading, still held the sea lanes around Africa. England had no great fleet of conquest, only determination, patience, and an appetite for learning. And so, rather than claim the world by force, England watched, measured, and recorded. The journals of sailors from this era are filled with small, ordinary details. The sound of rain on canvas, the taste of salted fish, the number of days without sight of land. Yet hidden within those pages is the quiet transformation of a nation. For the first time, England was beginning to see itself as a global power. Still, there were those who missed the old dreams of Calais, of banners, of armies, of France. To them, trade seemed too dull a substitute for glory. They longed for the days when English knights had ridden across Europe. But those days were gone. The new empire was not made of castles and cannons. It was made of contracts, ships, and maps. Even the language changed. Words like factor, charter, and colony entered common speech. Exploration became administration. Conquest became commerce. The sword had given way to the quill. Yet the dangers of the sea never faded. Ships disappeared in storms. Entire expeditions were lost to malaria, hunger, or mutiny. To the families waiting in English ports, months stretched into years. Letters rarely arrived. Sometimes, only the cargo returned. Ghostly ships drifting into harbour with no crew aboard. Sails torn, decks silent. The world was opening, but at a terrible cost. And still, more men signed up for the next voyage. Perhaps it was greed. Perhaps it was faith. Or perhaps it was the same old hunger that had once drawn England into France. The need to reach beyond the horizon. At the same time, science began to change how men thought about that horizon. Mathematicians refined the art of cartography. Astronomers mapped the heavens with new precision. Instruments like the astrolabe and cross-staff became common aboard ships. Knowledge that had once belonged to scholars now guided sailors. Each discovery brought the world into sharper focus. The more precisely men could measure the earth, the more they could control it. In the quiet study rooms of Oxford and Cambridge, men debated whether the earth was truly at the centre of the universe. The idea that the sun, not the earth, was the fixed point unsettled more than theology. It unsettled certainty itself. And yet, to sailors on the open sea, the sun was indeed the centre of their world. They lived by its light, measured by its rise and fall. Every compass needle, every calculation, every chart was an act of faith, not in God alone, but in reason. By the early 1600s, England's ships were seen in every ocean. The Levant Company traded with the Ottoman Empire. The Virginia Company sent settlers to the New World once more, determined to succeed where Roanoke had failed. Jamestown would rise from the swampy shores of Virginia in 1607, fragile, hungry, desperate, but enduring. With it began a chain of colonies that would one day stretch across the Atlantic, through the Caribbean, and into the far reaches of the Pacific. And at the heart of it all were two things: the sun and the compass. One gave light, the other gave direction. Together, they guided a small island toward a destiny that would shape centuries to come. By the time James III died in 1625, the age of exploration was no longer an adventure. It was an industry. England had gone from an anxious island kingdom, haunted by the loss of Calais, to a nation whose power was measured not in acres of land, but in miles of sea. What had been lost in France had been found across the world, though none could yet imagine how far that reach would grow. Calais had been the last stone of medieval England. The compass was the first instrument of its modern empire. The story that began with a fortress on the edge of France had come to rest on the decks of wooden ships sailing through infinite blue. The soldiers who once guarded Calais would not have recognized these new Englishmen. Sailors who fought with maps and trade, not swords and banners. But the hunger was the same. The desire to belong to something larger, to push outward, to leave a mark upon the world. That was England's inheritance, for better or worse. And so, under the same sun that had shone upon the fields of France and guided the sails across the Atlantic, England moved ever forward, steady, curious, unrelenting. The compass pointed north, the sun rose in the east, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the world waited. When the first sailors set their eyes upon distant shores, did they remember Calais? Did they think of the fortress once lost, or only of the endless blue before them? Perhaps in some quiet way both, because history, like the sea, never truly ends. It only changes direction. The sea has always been England's mirror, calm one moment, storm-tossed the next, always reflecting something of the island's soul. By the early 17th century, as English sails reached the edges of the known world, few remembered Calais. The maps that once showed its walls and marshes were now crowded with new names: Virginia, Bombay, Bantam, Jamestown. But if you looked closely, you could still trace the outline of the old story beneath it all, faint as an ink mark under centuries of parchment. Calais had not been forgotten. It had been absorbed, woven into England's nature, into its caution, its confidence, and its endless hunger to reach beyond itself. In the quiet libraries of Oxford and London, scholars still wrote about the loss, not with grief, but with the measured curiosity of time. They spoke of treaties, governors, the mistakes of Mary's reign. They listed the causes like physicians diagnosing a long-healed wound. Few paused to wonder what the loss had felt like. For those who had lived through it, the fall of Calais had been more than a military defeat. It was the end of an age, the breaking of an illusion that England could ever again belong to the continent. After Calais, England became an island not just in geography, but in mind. It is strange how loss can create identity. For 200 years, England's kings had called themselves rulers of both realms, of France and of England, united in ambition, if not in truth. Every coin bore the claim. Every court ceremony echoed it. And then, one winter morning, it was gone. From that absence grew something new. The sense of being apart, of facing outward rather than inward. It was as if the sea itself had risen to define the nation. That quiet shift, unnoticed at first, would shape the centuries that followed. The diplomacy, the wars, the ships, the empire, all of it, in some way, began with the loss of a fortress. The people who had once lived behind Calais' walls left traces that never entirely vanished. In the records of London's churches, you can still find their names, anglicised, misplaced, but there. merchants who fled with nothing but their ledgers, widows who married again in English ports, children who grew up speaking of a place across the water they would never see again. History seldom remembers them. It prefers the kings and the generals. But it was those quiet, ordinary lives that carried England's story forward. They built the houses, crewed the ships, and raised the generations who would later call themselves explorers. They did not know it, but they were the bridge between the old world of Calais and the new world of empire. Calais itself continued on, of course, a French town once more, its streets rebuilt, its fortifications strengthened. The French turned it into a symbol of resilience, just as England had turned it into one of loss. Travellers who visited a century later described the same harbour, the same damp air off the channel, the same watchtowers facing the sea. But there were no English banners now, only the blue and gold of France. And yet, some said, on quiet mornings when the mist rolled in from the dunes, you could still see the outlines of the old English bastions under the newer walls, ghostly shapes of stone beneath layers of repair, as if the city itself remembered what nations tried to forget. History, when viewed closely, is less a straight line than a tide. It comes in and out, returning old stories in new forms. In the 18th century, English merchants once again set foot in Calais, not as conquerors, but as visitors. They came to trade, to rest, to sail for the continent. Poets came too, drawn by the romance of proximity, the idea that England and France were forever linked by water and memory. When Charles Dickens wrote of Calais centuries later, he described it as the gateway to elsewhere, a place where England began and ended at once. Even in literature, the old echo lingered. Perhaps every empire carries within it the memory of its first loss. For England, that loss was Calais, the reminder that no claim is eternal, that power erodes like stone in salt air. And perhaps it was that memory that kept the English restless, unwilling to stand still, forever reaching for something beyond the horizon. It is easy to imagine that in some quiet chamber of the Queen's mind, in those last days of Mary Tudor, she understood this truth, that her sorrow was not only for a fortress, but for an idea. The belief that England could ever be secure upon foreign soil. In losing Calais, she lost the illusion of permanence. In that loss, the island awoke. The story might have ended there, with the fall of walls, the retreat of banners, and the fading of memory. But history never truly ends. It changes shape. The soldiers of Calais became sailors. The merchants became governors. The small island that once fought for a foothold in France came to rule half the globe, and then, in time, lost that too. Every rise carried the seed of another fall, and every fall whispered the lesson first learned at Calais. Nothing held is ever truly kept. Today, the sea between Dover and Calais is only 20 miles wide. On clear days, you can stand on the English cliffs and see the French coast, a thin grey line above the water. The ferries cross every hour. The ports hum with trade, tourism, the ordinary traffic of modern life. Few who make the crossing think of the centuries beneath those waves, of the soldiers who died in the marshes, of the merchants who fled, of the Queen who mourned. But the Channel remembers. Beneath the calm surface lie the stones of the old harbour, the timbers of ships that once carried England's last hope of France. They rest there quietly, like bones under sand, relics of a forgotten heartbeat. In the museums of both nations, you can still find the artifacts, coins, letters, scraps of uniform, fragments of maps. Each small thing tells the same large story, that power fades, but memory endures. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear it. The whisper of the tide against the old stones, saying what history always says in the end, that all empires, no matter how vast, are temporary, that the sea will have the last word. And so we return, after so many centuries, to that cold January morning in 1558, the sound of guns in the fog, the rush of soldiers through broken gates, the echo of boots on frozen earth. England's last stronghold in France was falling, and no one could stop it. Yet from that moment of defeat came everything that followed. The shift toward the sea, the birth of empire, the dream of exploration, the long arc of centuries that led to the modern world. History rarely moves forward in triumph. More often, it drifts outward through loss. When Mary Tudor whispered her final words, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart," she could not have known how right she was. Calais did not remain in her heart alone. It lodged in the heart of England itself, as a bruise, a lesson, a reminder that identity is often shaped by what we fail to keep. From that loss grew resilience. From that emptiness came expansion. It is a quiet truth, and a deeply human one, that sometimes, to find our direction, we must first lose our ground. And so the story ends, not with victory or empire, but with reflection, with the gentle sound of waves along a shore that has seen too much and forgotten nothing. The same water that once divided kings now carries ferries, trade, and quiet travellers. The same wind that once filled war banners now stirs the grass above the cliffs. History has softened, but if you close your eyes and listen, you can still hear it, faint and distant, like a bell beneath the sea. The echo of Calais, the whisper of a world that was lost, and all the worlds that followed. And perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you might wonder, how much of what we build today will one day lie beneath the waves, remembered only in fragments and echoes? History moves gently, but it never stops. And the tide, as always, is coming in.